My husband snapped my leg in front of his mistress and laughed. He looked down at me bleeding on the floor and told me that without him, I was nothing. He thought he had stolen my life savings, my company, and my future. He was so confident because my name was not on the corporate paperwork. But as the agonizing pain ripped through my shattered bone, I pulled out my phone and called my father. Exactly 10 minutes later, police sealed his office doors. His investors fled in a panic, and his greedy mistress watched his entire empire turn to dust. I invite you to listen to the story of how a broken leg became the ultimate weapon to destroy a traitor. My name is Sarah. I am 31 years old, and I work as the operations manager for a mid-sized investment firm in the heart of Boston. To the outside world, my husband Robert and I were the absolute picture of the perfect American power couple. He was 34, a charismatic, handsome CEO who frequently appeared on local business magazine covers, hailed as a financial visionary. But behind those glossy covers, behind the expensive tailored suits and the confident handshakes, I was the one who actually built the foundation of his entire life. When we first started this firm, we had nothing but a leased office space and a dream. I poured my blood, sweat, and my entire life savings into getting the business off the ground. I liquidated my carefully managed stock portfolios. I emptied my emergency funds. I even sold the antique jewelry my grandmother had left me. For 5 brutal years, I worked 80-hour weeks. I set up our entire digital infrastructure, managed the hiring, handled the payroll, and smoothed over every operational disaster. I skipped meals, I lost sleep, and I gave him every ounce of my youth, just so he could sit in that massive corner office and play the role of the brilliant leader. I loved him so deeply and trusted him so completely that I did not mind standing in his shadow. It was a freezing Tuesday evening in late November. The bitter wind was howling off Boston Harbor, rattling the tall floor-to-ceiling glass windows of our downtown high-rise. The office was completely empty. Everyone else had gone home to their families hours ago, but I had stayed behind in the quiet, dim glow of the archives room to audit some recent expense reports. Something had been bothering me for weeks. I had noticed a series of strange wire transfers. Large, inexplicable sums of money were quietly bleeding out of our primary operating accounts and disappearing into a seemingly random real estate trust. I had spent 6 exhausting hours digging through the complex digital files, tracing routing numbers and cross-referencing vendor invoices, until I finally found the undeniable, ugly truth. I printed out the bank statements, holding the warm paper in my trembling hands. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, but it was not from panic or confusion. It was a cold, sharp, devastating realization. The man I loved was stealing from the very company I had bled to build. I marched down the long carpeted hallway toward Robert's executive suite. His suite had a modern split-level design that he had specifically requested from our architect, featuring 3 heavy polished glass steps leading down into his main private lounge area. I did not knock. I simply grabbed the heavy brass handle and pushed open the frosted glass door. The scene that greeted me froze the blood in my veins and shattered my world into a million jagged pieces. There on the imported Italian leather sofa, the very same sofa I had painstakingly selected and purchased for him as a gift for our 5th wedding anniversary, was my husband. He was intimately, shamelessly entangled with Chloe, the 28-year-old legal director of our firm. Her blonde hair was a mess, her expensive silk blouse was unbuttoned, and Robert had his hands roaming all over her. The cloying sweet scent of her designer floral perfume filled the air, mixing with the sharp smell of expensive scotch they had been drinking. They froze the exact moment the heavy glass door clicked shut behind me. Chloe gasped loudly and scrambled to pull her shirt together, her face flushing a deep, guilty red. She looked terrified, pulling her skirt down and backing away to the far edge of the sofa. Robert, however, did not flinch. He simply let out a long, heavy sigh. He did not look panicked. He did not look ashamed. He looked incredibly annoyed, exactly like a privileged child who had just been interrupted during a fun game. Any other woman might have collapsed right there in a fit of hysterical tears. Any other woman might have screamed, thrown things across the room, or demanded to know why her husband was destroying their marriage. But I am an operations manager. I deal with high-stakes crises for a living. The sheer overwhelming magnitude of his betrayal bypassed my tear ducts entirely and settled directly into my spine like a rod of solid freezing steel. I walked slowly down the 3 glass steps, my heels clicking sharply and rhythmically in the quiet room. I walked right up to his massive mahogany desk and threw the thick stack of printed bank statements directly onto the polished wood. The papers fanned out perfectly, exposing the highlighted transactions and the undeniable proof of his financial crimes. "You can stop fixing your shirt, Chloe," I said, my voice terrifyingly calm and level. "I am not here to fight over a cheating husband. I am here to talk about the $1 million luxury condo you just purchased in the Seaport district using our company operating funds." Chloe completely froze, her hands hovering nervously over her collar. Her eyes darted toward Robert in sheer, unadulterated panic. She knew exactly what those papers meant. She knew I had caught them committing a severe financial crime. Robert slowly stood up, casually tucking his custom shirt into his trousers. He walked over to the desk, barely glanced at the bank statements, and let out a short, dismissive laugh. "You have been snooping through my private accounts, Sarah," he said, shaking his head. "That is a serious violation of corporate policy. I could have you fired for breaching confidentiality protocols." "Your private accounts?" I scoffed, feeling a wave of absolute sickening disgust wash over me. I liquidated my entire stock portfolio to keep this company afloat 2 years ago, when your investors backed out. I worked every single weekend while you played golf with potential clients, and you took the money we made together, the money I bled for, to buy a luxury penthouse for your legal director. That is not a policy violation, Robert. That is federal embezzlement. Robert leaned back against his heavy desk, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with a gaze so cold, so incredibly condescending, that it felt like looking into the eyes of a complete stranger. The charming, loving man I had married was completely gone. In his place stood a greedy, arrogant monster who felt entirely untouchable. "Let us get one thing totally straight right now, Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "This is my company. I am the chief executive officer. The board of directors answers to me. The high net worth clients sign their contracts with me. You just push papers around and make sure the administrative staff is doing their jobs. Do not confuse your daily chores with actual corporate value. I bought Chloe that condo because she actually understands my grand vision for this firm. She's my intellectual equal. You're just a glorified secretary who happened to be around when I needed a startup loan." His cruel words were specifically designed to break me down, to make me feel small, worthless, and completely insignificant. He wanted to strip away my dignity and remind me that on paper, he held all the legal power. Because I had trusted him implicitly when we first incorporated the business, he had convinced me to keep my name off the primary ownership documents. He had claimed it would be much better for tax purposes and liability protection. I had loved him so much that I signed the corporate paperwork without a second thought, effectively making myself a standard employee in the company I had funded. But I was not stupid. I knew where the real power lay, and I knew how to secure my own leverage. I looked past him and saw his sleek, silver-encrypted laptop sitting open on the side table near the window. That laptop contained the master financial ledger. It held the unedited digital footprint of every single fraudulent wire transfer, every fake invoice, and every shell company he and Chloe had executed over the past year. If I secured that laptop and handed it to the authorities, I had the undeniable proof I needed to freeze his accounts and send him straight to federal prison. Without saying another word, I lunged forward, reaching desperately for the computer. Robert saw my eyes shift toward the table. He realized exactly what I was going for. In a split second, the smug, arrogant expression on his face twisted into pure, unadulterated, violent rage. He lunged at me with the aggressive, brutal force of a linebacker. "Get your hands off my property!" he roared at the top of his lungs. He slammed his heavy hands into my shoulders and shoved me violently backward. The force of his sudden physical attack caught me completely off guard. I stumbled backward, my high heels catching on the slick, polished surface of the office floor. My arms flailed wildly in the air, trying to find a desk, a chair, anything to grab onto, but there was nothing around me but empty space. I fell backward toward the split-level drop. My right foot missed the edge of the top tier, and I plunged heavily down the 3-glass stairs. The fall seemed to happen in agonizing slow motion, yet it was over in a terrifying, violent instant. My right leg twisted beneath my body at an unnatural, horrifying angle as my full body weight crashed down onto the hard, unyielding glass edge of the bottom step. A sickening, incredibly loud crack echoed through the silent office space. It was a sound I will never forget for as long as I live. The brutal sound of my own tibia bones snapping entirely in half. A scream of pure blinding agony tore violently from my throat. The physical pain was absolute and totally overwhelming, feeling like a white-hot fire that shot from my shin straight up into my brain. I collapsed onto the floor, clutching my ruined leg, gasping desperately for air as dark black spots danced in my vision. The pain was so incredibly intense, my stomach violently lurched and a freezing cold sweat instantly broke out across my forehead and neck. Through the fabric of my trousers, I could feel the sharp, jagged edge of the broken bone pressing dangerously against my skin from the inside. Chloe let out a sharp, terrified shriek, taking a hesitant step forward. "Oh my God, Robert. She's really hurt. Her leg is broken. We need to call an ambulance." But Robert immediately threw his arm out, stopping Chloe from moving any closer to me. He stood tall at the top of the glass steps, looking down at me as I writhed in agony on the floor. There was no panic in his eyes. There was no remorse, no guilt, no hesitation. There was not even a single shred of human empathy for the woman who had spent 5 years unconditionally loving him and building his life. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit jacket, a cruel, victorious smile spreading slowly across his handsome face. He actually enjoyed seeing me like this. He enjoyed seeing the woman who had dared to confront him now broken, helpless, and bleeding at his feet. "What exactly are you going to do now, Sarah?" He sneered, his voice echoing coldly in the large, dimly lit room. "Are you going to call the cops? Go ahead and try. Tell them you tripped in your high heels while throwing a hysterical, jealous tantrum because I fired you. Who do you think the police will believe? A wealthy, highly respected corporate CEO or an unstable, disgruntled employee who simply could not handle losing her job?" I lay there on the cold floor, gritting my teeth so hard my jaw ached, trying desperately to breathe through the continuous waves of excruciating pain. My hands shook violently as I gripped my leg, feeling the warm trickle of blood soaking through my clothes. "Every single corporate asset is strictly in my name." He continued, stepping down one single stair to loom closer over my broken body. The beautiful house in Brookline, the luxury cars, the offshore bank accounts, the company equity. You gave it all to me voluntarily. You signed the legal paperwork yourself because you were foolish enough to trust me. Without me, you are a total nobody who walks away with absolutely nothing. You are going to pack your personal things, you are going to hobble out of my building tonight, and you are going to disappear forever. Because if you try to fight me, if you try to take a single dime, I will bankrupt you in court until you are sleeping on the street. He laughed again, a harsh, dismissive sound that cut right through my soul before turning his back on me to face Chloe. "Grab your coat. We are leaving right now. Let the night janitor deal with her in the morning." He truly thought he had won. He truly believed he had broken my spirit just as easily and completely as he had broken my bones. He believed I was just a naive, powerless woman who had been foolish enough to hand over her life savings to a charismatic man, leaving myself completely defenseless. But as the agonizing pain continued to rip through my shattered leg, a very different kind of fire ignited deep within my chest. He had made a massive, fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that because I played the humble, supportive wife, I was weak. He had assumed that because my name was not on his precious incorporation papers, I had absolutely no power or leverage in this city. He did not know who I really was. He did not know the incredibly powerful bloodline I came from. And he was about to find out that breaking my leg was the most expensive, devastating mistake he would ever make in his entire pathetic life. The searing pain radiating from my shattered tibia was a blinding, white-hot fire that threatened to pull me into unconsciousness. I lay crumpled on the hard floor at the bottom of the glass steps, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The warm, metallic scent of my own blood filled the air, soaking through the fabric of my tailored trousers and pulling on the pristine imported tiles. Robert stood at the top of the stairs, fixing the cuffs of his bespoke suit, looking down at me with a chilling mixture of absolute disgust and arrogant triumph. He had just brutally assaulted his wife to protect his mistress, and he honestly believed he was completely untouchable. He believed he held all the cards because my name was not on the corporate registration documents. He believed I was just a naive, dedicated operations manager who had foolishly handed over her life savings to fund his brilliant vision. But as I pressed my trembling hand against my broken leg to stabilize the bone, a profound, icy clarity washed over my mind. The shock and the heartbreak instantly vaporized, completely replaced by a cold, calculating fury. Robert had made a fatal miscalculation. For our entire 5-year marriage, I had played a very specific role. I had carefully hidden a massive secret about my identity, all to protect his incredibly fragile, insecure ego. When we first met, Robert was a struggling junior associate, drowning in student debt. He was brilliant, yes, but he was also deeply resentful of anyone who came from wealth. He harbored a toxic, obsessive hatred for what he called trust fund kids and nepo babies. He constantly complained about how the system was rigged, how self-made men like him had to fight for scraps, while the children of the elite walked into corner offices. He needed to feel like the smartest, most powerful person in the room. He needed to be the savior, the self-made titan who built an empire from the dirt up. Because I loved him so unconditionally back then, I decided to give him exactly what he needed. I told him I grew up middle class. I told him my father was just a retired, low-level accountant living quietly in a modest suburb. I let Robert believe that the seed money we used to start this firm came entirely from my personal savings and a lucky bank loan. I let him believe he was the sole mastermind of his own destiny. He had absolutely no idea that my father is William Harrison. He had no idea that the quiet retired accountant he occasionally spoke to on the phone during holidays is actually a Wall Street titan, a ruthless private equity billionaire, and the former director of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. He had no idea that the anonymous venture capital grant that saved his firm from bankruptcy 2 years ago did not come from a lucky pitch meeting, but directly from one of my father's shell corporations. I had orchestrated the entire thing to save my husband's dream, structuring the capital injection through a blind trust, so Robert would never feel like he was accepting a handout from his wife's family. Robert thought I was weak. He thought I was alone. He did not know that the blood running through my veins belonged to a man who destroyed corrupt corporations before breakfast. Through the agonizing waves of pain, I forced my shaking hand into the pocket of my blazer. My fingers felt numb and clumsy as they wrapped around the cool metal of my smartphone. I pulled it out, smearing fresh blood across the screen as I swiped upward to unlock it. Chloe noticed the movement. She was standing a few feet behind Robert, hastily buttoning up her silk blouse, her eyes wide with lingering panic. "Robert, look out." She pointed a manicured finger at me, her voice shrill and trembling. "She has her phone. She's going to dial 911. You have to take it away from her. If the police see her leg like this, they will arrest you." Robert did not panic. He simply let out a low, mocking laugh. He casually walked down the glass steps, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply in the quiet office. He stopped just inches from my bleeding leg and stared down at me with profound amusement. "Let her make the call, Chloe," he said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "Let her call the police. Who do you think they are going to believe? A respected chief executive officer with a spotless record, or a hysterical, terminated employee who tripped and fell down the stairs after a jealous meltdown? Even if they investigate, my lawyers will tie her up in court for the next 10 years. She cannot afford to fight me. She has zero capital. Every single bank account is legally in my name. I own the house. I own the cars. I own the firm. Let her call whoever she wants." My fingers gripped the phone tightly. I did not dial 911. Calling the local police would only result in a messy, drawn-out domestic dispute. I did not want a domestic dispute. I wanted complete, instantaneous annihilation. I opened my encrypted contacts list and pressed the direct line to my father. The phone rang twice. The sound of the ringing seemed incredibly loud in the silent, tense atmosphere of the office. Robert crossed his arms, smirking down at me, completely convinced I was dialing for an ambulance or calling some helpless friend to come drag me away. Then the call connected. "Sarah," my father's voice came through the speaker. It was deep calm and carried the unmistakable heavy authority of a man who commanded absolute obedience. The sound of his voice instantly grounded me, cutting right through the blinding pain in my shattered tibia. "Dad!" I spoke into the receiver. My voice was tight and strained from the physical agony, but the words were perfectly clear and completely steady. Robert just broke my leg. Triggered the morality clause. The silence on the other end of the line lasted for exactly 2 seconds. It was not a silence of shock or confusion. It was the terrifying, calculating silence of a predator locking onto its target. I understand. My father said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet, icy register that sent a shiver straight down my spine. An ambulance and a federal transport unit are being dispatched to your location right now. Do not move. Do not let him leave your sight. He is finished. The line went dead. I let my phone slip from my bloody fingers. It hit the floor with a soft clatter. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, breathing in through my nose, embracing the searing pain in my leg, because I knew it was the absolute last time Robert would ever have the upper hand. Robert stared at me, his brow furrowed in sudden, deep confusion. The smug, arrogant smile on his face faltered for just a fraction of a second. He looked back at Chloe, then down at me again. Triggered the morality clause. He repeated my words slowly, letting out a loud, theatrical bark of laughter that echoed off the high ceiling. What the hell was that, Sarah? Are you completely delusional from the pain? Who exactly were you talking to? Your pathetic old man in his little suburban house. What is a retired bookkeeper going to do to me? Write me a strongly worded letter. You are losing your mind. Chloe stepped out from the shadows, wrapping her arms around herself, trying to mirror Robert's forced confidence. She let out a nervous, high-pitched giggle. She's just trying to scare you, Robert, Chloe said, stepping down to the edge of the first glass stair. She knows she has absolutely nothing left. She probably called her dad to come pick her up in his beat-up old sedan, so she does not have to pay for a hospital transport. We should just leave her here for the security guards to find. I do not want to be in the same room as her anymore. She's crazy. I did not answer them. I did not scream. I did not cry. And I did not try to explain the colossal, apocalyptic mistake they had just made. Arguing with a dead man walking is a complete waste of breath. When Robert had eagerly signed the master funding agreement with the anonymous venture capital firm 2 years ago, he had been so blinded by his own greed and desperation that he had completely ignored the fine print. He had instructed Chloe, his supposedly brilliant legal director, to review the contracts. But Chloe was lazy, incompetent, and far more interested in sleeping with the boss than doing her actual job. She had skimmed the documents and told him to sign. They had entirely missed the morality and fiduciary breach clause buried on page 47 of the Master Debt Covenant. The clause explicitly stated that if the majority stakeholder of the borrowing entity committed any act of gross moral turpitude, domestic violence, or financial fraud, the lending trust had the immediate unilateral right to recall all funding, freeze all operating assets, and seize total control of the corporate board without prior notice. My father was the sole executor of that lending trust, and I had just given him the green light to unleash hell. I lay perfectly still on the cold concrete floor, cradling my broken leg. I slowly turned my head and locked my eyes directly onto the large, sleek digital clock mounted on the wall above Robert's desk. The glowing red numbers read exactly 7:42 in the evening. Robert watched me staring at the clock. His irritation flared up again. He hated being ignored. He hated that I was not begging for his mercy or crying over the loss of my marriage. "Are you deaf, Sarah?" he barked, taking a threatening step toward my head. "I told you that you are finished. You are entirely replaceable. Chloe is 10 times the woman you are, and she actually belongs in this world of wealth and power. You belong exactly where you are right now, bleeding on the floor at my feet. Now drag yourself out of my building before I decide to break your other leg." I kept my eyes entirely locked on the glowing red numbers of the digital clock. 7:43, 7:44. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of my breathing and the soft rhythmic clicking of the ventilation system. Every single second that ticked by felt heavy, charged with an invisible electric tension. I could feel the massive invisible gears of my father's financial empire shifting into motion all across the city. Wires were being halted. Accounts were being locked. Emergency injunctions were being filed by a small army of elite corporate lawyers who were currently descending upon the federal courthouse. "What are you staring at?" Robert yelled, clearly unnerved by my complete silence. His voice cracked slightly. The adrenaline of his violent outburst was wearing off, replaced by a creeping, inexplicable paranoia. He looked at the clock, then back at me, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. I pressed my hand harder against the sharp protrusion of my broken bone. I tasted blood on my lips where I had bitten down to stop from screaming. I finally pulled my gaze away from the clock and looked directly up into Robert's eyes. "I am just counting down the minutes, Robert," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it sliced through the quiet room like a razor blade. "Counting down to what?" He sneered, though he took a small involuntary step backward. "Counting down to the end of your life," I replied calmly. Chloe let out a scoffing noise, but she did not move any closer. Robert glared at me, his chest heaving. He opened his mouth to hurl another insult, to tell me again how worthless and powerless I was, to brag about the $1 million condo and the offshore accounts he thought he controlled. But he never got the chance to speak. At exactly 7:52, the heavy silence of the executive suite was violently shattered. The glowing red numbers on the digital wall clock shifted from 7:51 to 7:52. At that exact moment, the heavy, suffocating silence of the executive suite was shattered by a sound so sharp and demanding, it made Chloe physically jump. It was the multi-line telephone sitting squarely on Robert's massive mahogany desk. A split second later, the personal cell phone, resting in Robert's tailored trouser pocket, began to vibrate and ring with a frantic urgency. For a man who considered himself the untouchable king of his own corporate castle, receiving 2 simultaneous calls at this hour of the evening was highly unusual. Robert frowned, his arrogant smirk melting into a look of profound annoyance. He clearly thought this was just a minor administrative nuisance, a pesky interruption to his triumphant moment of putting me in my place. He pulled the cell phone from his pocket, glanced at the glowing caller identification screen, and let out an exasperated sigh. "It is Greg, the chief accountant," Robert muttered, rolling his eyes at Chloe as if he were dealing with a persistent toddler. "The man cannot do a single thing without holding my hand. Let me handle this idiot, and then we will leave her here for the night shift security to sweep up." Robert pressed the green button on his phone and casually activated the speakerphone, tossing the device onto the polished wood of his desk. He leaned over it, projecting the absolute authority of a man who believed he held the entire world in the palm of his hand. "Greg, it is nearly 8 o'clock at night," Robert barked, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm in the middle of a very sensitive personal matter. This had better be a literal fire in the building, or you're going to be looking for a new job on Monday morning." The voice that echoed out of the small speaker was not the usual calm, subservient tone of his chief accountant. Greg was hyperventilating. His words came out in a chaotic, breathless rush, practically shouting through the phone. "Robert, we have a massive problem." Greg gasped, sounding like a man who had just watched his entire house burn to the ground. "The Primary Funding Trust just issued a direct notice to our banking partners. They have initiated a total immediate recall on all of our callable debt. Every single dollar of our mezzanine financing is being pulled right now." Robert froze. The color began to drain from his face, leaving his normally tanned skin looking like pale, sickly ash. I lay on the floor, pressing my hands against the agonizing, throbbing pain of my shattered tibia, but a cold, deeply satisfying smile began to form on my lips. Robert had built his entire glamorous empire on a foundation of heavily leveraged debt. He was incredibly proud of his rapid expansion, but that expansion was entirely funded by the anonymous venture capital trust I had secretly secured for him through my father. He had signed the contracts believing he could outsmart the lenders, thinking the callable debt structure was just a standard formality. He honestly thought he was too big to fail. He did not know that a callable debt meant the lending institution had the absolute legal right to demand full repayment of the principal loan at any given moment without warning and without a grace period. "What are you talking about, Greg?" Robert yelled, leaning closer to the phone, his voice completely losing its smooth, charismatic edge. "They cannot just recall the debt tonight. That is tens of millions of dollars. Tell their legal representatives that we will negotiate terms on Monday morning during normal business hours. Tell them to back off." "I cannot tell them anything," Greg shouted back, pure panic vibrating through the speaker. "They are not negotiating, Robert. The trust explicitly stated that they are triggering a default covenant. They cited a direct violation of the morality and fiduciary breach clause. The words hung in the air of the executive suite, heavy and absolute. The morality clause. Robert slowly lifted his head. His wide, terrified eyes drifted away from the phone and landed directly on me. He stared at me, lying in a pool of my own blood on the cold tile floor. The exact words I had spoken into my phone just 10 minutes earlier finally registered in his thick, arrogant skull. He had mocked me. He had laughed at me for calling my retired suburban father. The horrifying realization of what I had actually done began to dawn on him, but his brain simply refused to accept it. "That makes absolutely no sense," Robert stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the phone. "It is a faceless institutional trust. They do not know anything about my personal life. Call the bank and initiate an emergency block on the outward transfers. Use the reserve capital to show liquidity. Do it right now, Greg." "I cannot do that, Robert." Greg's voice was now trembling with tears of sheer despair. "The bank is not taking my calls. The automated portals are shutting down. Robert, I think we are going under." Before Robert could scream another order, Chloe let out a sudden, terrified gasp from the other side of the room. She had rushed over to her own workstation, desperately opening her laptop to check the company's internal banking portal. Her face was illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screen, and her eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated horror. The confident, smug mistress, who had mocked me just minutes ago, was now shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. "Robert!" Chloe cried out, her voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal. "Robert, look at the screens. The operating accounts are showing a zero available balance. The bank has put a hard freeze on everything. The payroll accounts, the vendor payment lines, even the emergency contingency funds. Everything is completely locked down." Robert abandoned the phone and scrambled over to Chloe's desk, nearly tripping over his own expensive leather shoes. He pushed her aside and stared wildly at the monitor. Large, glaring red banners flashed across the banking software, displaying severe restriction codes. "This is impossible," he whispered, his hands hovering uselessly over the keyboard. "A debt recall takes days to process. They have to go through a judge. They cannot freeze operating liquidity instantly. They simply cannot do this." "Yes, they can, Robert." I finally spoke, my voice cutting cleanly through the chaotic panic consuming the room. The pain in my broken leg was blinding, but the absolute victory of this moment gave me an incredible surge of adrenaline. Robert and Chloe both snapped their heads toward me. They looked like two trapped animals staring at a hunter. "When you initiated those massive fraudulent wire transfers to buy Chloe her luxury penthouse, you triggered an automated suspicious activity report." I explained slowly, ensuring every single word landed like a physical blow. Normally, it takes the authorities weeks to review those reports. But when the sole executor of the lending trust personally flags those transactions for suspected wire fraud and pushes them directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the response is immediate. My father does not like waiting, Robert. He made sure the SEC issued a federal freeze on your entire financial network before you could even finish pouring your second glass of scotch tonight. Robert stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find air. The gears in his mind were grinding together, finally connecting the dots he had been too arrogant to see for the past 5 years. The quiet, boring accountant he thought was my father. The miraculous anonymous venture capital funding that had saved his firm. The morality clause. The instant catastrophic federal intervention. William Harrison. Robert choked out the name, his voice barely a raspy whisper. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a heavy leather chair. "Your father is William Harrison, the former director of the SEC. I gave him a slow, agonizingly cold smile. "Surprise, darling," I said. Chloe let out a loud sob, burying her face in her hands. She was a legal director, which meant she fully understood the apocalyptic nature of the situation. A federal freeze initiated by an SEC red flag meant their passports would be flagged. It meant their personal assets would be seized. It meant they were not just losing a company, they were facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The $1 million condo she had purchased with stolen funds was now the exact piece of physical evidence that would lock her in a prison cell for the best years of her life. Robert suddenly snapped out of his state of shock. His survival instincts kicked in, driven by pure selfish desperation. He turned away from Chloe and lunged frantically toward the encrypted silver laptop sitting on the side table. This was the master machine. It contained the direct access portals to his offshore shell companies. He thought if he could just bypass the corporate network, He could manually wire his hidden digital assets into an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet and flee the country before the authorities could physically arrive. He flipped the laptop open, his fingers slamming violently against the keys as he tried to type in his master administrative password. He typed it once. A large red error message flashed on the screen. Access denied. He cursed loudly, sweating profusely, and typed the password again, slower this time. Access denied. Administrative privileges revoked. What did you do? He screamed, picking up the laptop and shaking it as if he could force the machine to obey him. What did you do to my computer? I am the operations manager, Robert. I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of pity. Did you honestly think I would confront you about embezzlement without completely revoking your network access first? I locked you out of the server 3 hours ago. Your offshore accounts are currently being drained back into the primary corporate fund by my father's forensic accounting team. You have no money, you have no leverage, you are completely bankrupt. Just as the reality of his total financial ruin washed over him, Chloe's personal cell phone began to chime relentlessly. She reached into her designer purse with trembling hands and pulled out the device. She stared at the screen, tears ruining her perfectly applied makeup, spilling dark tracks down her pale cheeks. It is an emergency email from the board of directors. Chloe read aloud, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. Notice of emergency shareholder action. The majority stakeholder by proxy has invoked emergency bylaws. Robert has been officially suspended from his position as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately pending a full criminal investigation. Chloe dropped her phone. It hit the floor with a dull thud. She looked at Robert, realizing that the golden goose she had staked her entire future on was completely dead. He was no longer a wealthy, powerful CEO. He was a disgraced, bankrupt criminal who was about to lose his freedom. And because she had helped him steal the money, she was going down right beside him. Robert stood completely frozen in the center of the office. The tailored suit that had looked so commanding just 20 minutes ago now hung on his deflated frame like a cheap costume. The sheer speed of his downfall was staggering. In the span of exactly 10 minutes, the empire he had built on my back had been systematically and ruthlessly dismantled. Every single safety net, every single escape route, every single dollar had been meticulously stripped away. He turned slowly to look at me. The panic in his eyes suddenly vanished, replaced by a dark, incredibly violent rage. He had nothing left to lose, and his fragile, pathetic ego simply could not handle the fact that his quiet, supportive wife was the architect of his absolute destruction. He realized that I was the one holding all the power. I had played him flawlessly. He let out a primal, deafening roar of pure hatred. He dropped the useless laptop onto the floor and lunged down the glass steps directly toward me. His hands were curled into tight, murderous fists. He was coming to destroy me, to silence the woman who had humiliated him, to inflict as much pain as he possibly could before his world completely ended. I could not move. The excruciating pain in my broken leg kept me pinned to the floor, rendering me completely defenseless against his impending attack. I braced myself for the impact, staring defiantly up into the eyes of the monster charging at me. But Robert never reached me. Just as his foot hit the bottom step, a sudden piercing sound tore through the quiet evening air. It was loud, chaotic, and completely deafening. The wail of multiple police sirens erupted from the street directly below the high-rise window. The blinding, flashing reflection of bright red and blue emergency lights bounced violently off the floor to ceiling glass panes of the executive suite, illuminating the dark office in a frantic strobe light display of impending justice. The sirens multiplied, growing louder and more aggressive by the second, signaling the arrival of a massive coordinated law enforcement raid. Robert stopped dead in his tracks. His body went completely rigid, suspended in a state of absolute terror. He stared at the flashing red and blue lights painting the walls of his office, the realization finally hitting him with the crushing weight of a collapsing building. He was trapped. There was no talking his way out. There was no hiding behind corporate paperwork. The authorities were not coming to take a statement about a workplace accident. They were coming to take him away in handcuffs. He stood frozen in the center of the flashing lights, listening to the heavy approaching sound of combat boots slamming against the marble floors of the lobby downstairs, completely paralyzed by the terrifying sound of his own inescapable doom. The heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots against the polished marble floor of the lobby below vibrated directly up through the floorboards of the executive suite. Robert stood completely frozen at the bottom of the glass stairs. The blinding emergency lights flashing from the street outside painted his pale, terrified face in alternating harsh shades of furious red and icy blue. He took a hesitant, trembling step toward the main exit, perhaps driven by some deeply ingrained primal instinct to run and hide, but his legs seemed firmly rooted to the spot. Before his panicked brain could even formulate a coherent thought, the heavy frosted double doors of his private office were violently thrown open. They did not just swing open gracefully, they slammed against the expensive mahogany walls with a tremendous force that made the reinforced glass rattle loudly in its metallic frames. A massive flood of dark, imposing uniforms poured instantly into the room. Boston police officers, with their hands resting cautiously on their heavy utility belts, moved in first. They fanned out with practiced military precision to secure every corner of the perimeter. Right behind them marched a wave of men and women in stark, nondescript suits, wearing those unmistakable navy blue windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their backs. This was no simple welfare check. This was not a routine noise complaint. It was a fully coordinated, heavily armed federal raid. Robert desperately tried to straighten his posture. He puffed out his chest, attempting to summon the commanding, untouchable corporate persona he had always used to intimidate his junior staff and manipulate his investors. He raised his hands in a weak, placating gesture, forcing a remarkably fake, trembling smile onto his sweating face. "Officers, there has been a terrible misunderstanding here tonight," Robert announced. His voice wavered pitifully, completely lacking the smooth, arrogant charisma he had displayed just moments before. "My wife had a tragic, clumsy accident on these stairs. She simply tripped in her heels. I was just about to call for an ambulance to help her. There is absolutely no need for this level of extreme force in my private corporate office." The lead FBI agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved from solid granite, did not even blink. He completely ignored Robert's pathetic attempt at damage control. His sharp, highly trained eyes scanned the large room, instantly processing the chaotic scene. He saw the printed bank statements scattered carelessly across the mahogany desk. He saw Chloe cowering in the far corner, clutching her expensive designer blouse together in sheer terror. And then his stern gaze lowered to the floor, and he saw me. I was lying in a rapidly expanding pool of my own blood, my hands gripping my shattered leg, fighting to stay conscious through the blinding waves of pain. "We have a victim down with severe skeletal trauma. Send the medical team in right now." The lead agent barked sharply into the radio microphone clipped tightly to his shoulder. Within mere seconds, 2 emergency medical technicians rushed through the dense sea of dark uniforms. They carried heavy green trauma bags and pushed a collapsible metallic stretcher. They knelt swiftly beside me on the cold tile, their expressions intensely focused and strictly professional. "Ma'am, I need you to stay perfectly still and keep breathing for me," the female paramedic said softly. Her gloved hands moved with incredible care as she gently examined the mangled, unnatural angle of my lower shin. "I know the pain is absolutely unbearable right now, but we are going to get you stabilized, and we are going to get you out of this building safely." I managed a weak nod, biting down so hard on my lower lip that I tasted fresh copper. A new wave of blinding white-hot agony washed over my entire body as she touched the swollen skin around the fracture. Taking heavy trauma shears from her belt, she carefully cut away the blood-soaked fabric of my tailored trousers to expose the gruesome injury. As she prepared a rigid splint to secure my broken tibia, she glanced at the immense volume of blood staining the floor. "This was absolutely no simple trip and fall accident," she muttered under her breath, her voice laced with intense anger. She glared fiercely up at Robert, her eyes filled with absolute disgust. Someone used a massive amount of deliberate physical force to cause this kind of catastrophic damage. I squeezed my eyes shut, letting the sterile, sharp scent of medical alcohol ground me to reality. For the first time in 5 long, grueling years, I was not the one rushing to fix a corporate disaster. I was not the one staying up until 3 in the morning to balance the books and cover for my husband's mistakes. I was finally the one being rescued, and the psychological relief I felt in that moment was almost as overwhelming as the intense physical agony radiating from my leg. While the medical team worked frantically to secure my broken bones, the lead FBI agent stepped directly into Robert's personal space. Robert instinctively took a clumsy step backward, his hip hitting the sharp edge of his expensive mahogany desk. Robert Evans, the agent, said, his deep voice echoing loudly and clearly in the tense room. "You are not just dealing with a standard domestic incident tonight. My field office received a highly comprehensive, heavily encrypted digital dossier exactly 20 minutes ago. This data file contained irrefutable, deeply verified evidence of massive corporate embezzlement, international wire fraud, and the illegal creation of multiple offshore shell companies." Robert's jaw dropped open. The absolute last tiny shred of his arrogant confidence instantly evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, pathetic shell of a man. He looked down at me, his eyes wide with a horrifying, sickening realization. He finally understood the terrible truth. He realized that I had not just been crying alone in the dark while he was out entertaining his mistress. For the last 3 months, while he was busy spending my hard-earned money to fund his glamorous lifestyle, I had been meticulously and quietly compiling every single fraudulent financial transaction he had ever made. I had tracked the hidden IP addresses. I had traced the international routing numbers. I had built a completely watertight federal criminal case against him, and my father had just handed that explosive evidence directly to the highest authorities in the country on a silver platter. Across the room, 2 federal agents approached Chloe. She was pressed flat against the wall, hyperventilating wildly. Thick, dark tears streamed down her pale face, completely ruining her flawless, expensive makeup. The confident, smug legal director, who had sneered at me just minutes ago, was now shaking like a fragile leaf in a violent hurricane. "Do not touch me!" Chloe cried out, her voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I am a licensed attorney. I demand to call my legal representation right now. I had absolutely nothing to do with this fraud. Robert forced me to sign those documents. He made me do everything." An agent simply stepped forward with an expression of pure boredom and pulled her trembling hands away from her chest. "Save that story for the federal judge," the agent replied coldly. Another agent walked over to her pristine glass desk and carefully bagged her sleek silver laptop, sealing it firmly with bright red evidence tape. Chloe watched her expensive computer disappear into the clear plastic bag, and a loud, gut-wrenching sob escaped her throat. She knew with absolute certainty that her entire life was trapped inside that hard drive. Her prestigious law license, her social reputation, her freedom, and the $1 million penthouse she thought she had secured for herself were all completely gone. The glamorous, wealthy life she thought she had successfully stolen from me was officially over. She sank heavily to her knees, burying her face in her hands, weeping loudly as the crushing reality of a decade in federal prison crashed down upon her shoulders. The lead agent turned his attention back to my husband, who was trembling so violently he could barely stand. "Robert Evans, you are formally under arrest for aggravated assault, grand larceny, and multiple felony counts of federal wire fraud," the agent declared. He grabbed Robert forcefully by the shoulder and spun him around. Robert let out a pathetic, strangled cry as his arms were wrenched roughly behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of cold metal handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists sounded like absolute music to my ringing ears. This was the man who had mocked my endless dedication. This was the man who had called me a glorified secretary and told me I had zero value. This was the monster who had violently shoved me down a flight of glass stairs and laughed out loud as my bones snapped in half. Now he was being treated exactly like the common lowly criminal he truly was. The expensive, custom-tailored suit jacket he was so incredibly proud of bunched up awkwardly around his shoulders. His perfect styled hair was a sweaty, disheveled mess. He looked weak, small, and utterly pathetic. He was no longer a king. He was just a terrified boy who had finally been caught stealing. The paramedics successfully managed to secure my splintered leg and carefully lifted me onto the rolling stretcher. They moved smoothly and efficiently, navigating through the busy crowd of federal agents who were currently tearing the executive suite apart. Heavy file cabinets were being pulled open. Encrypted hard drives were being confiscated. The beautiful, pristine office I had spent 5 years of my youth helping to build was being thoroughly and systematically dismantled by the long, unforgiving arm of the law. As the paramedics slowly wheeled my stretcher toward the large frosted glass doors to take me to the waiting ambulance, The lead agent pushed Robert forward, guiding the handcuffed man toward the exit. Our paths intersected perfectly in the very center of the room. The paramedics paused for just a brief moment to adjust their grip on the heavy stretcher, bringing me face to face with my husband one final time. Robert looked down at me. His face was a tragic mask of pure terror, deep humiliation, and profound suffocating regret. He looked at my pale, exhausted face. He looked at my blood-soaked clothes. He looked at the rigid medical splint holding my shattered leg together. The reality of what he had destroyed finally pierced through his narcissistic delusions. He had thrown away a fiercely loyal wife who would have moved mountains for him, all for a fleeting affair and a few stolen dollars. He opened his mouth to speak. Perhaps he wanted to beg for my mercy. Perhaps he wanted to offer a pathetic, empty apology to save his own skin. But I refused to give him the satisfaction of hearing his own voice. I refused to let him control the narrative for even one more second. I looked up directly into the fearful eyes of the man who had broken my heart and my body, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, overwhelming sense of triumph. I held his gaze, firmly demanding his full attention, making entirely sure he heard and understood every single syllable of my final goodbye. I watched the realization of his catastrophic failure settle deep into his bones. He knew my father would ensure he never saw the outside of a prison cell again. "You were right," I said, my voice incredibly calm and perfectly clear in the silent space between us. "Without you, I am nothing. I am just William Harrison's daughter." The paramedics pushed the stretcher forward, rolling me out of the office and leaving him standing there in the ruins of his own making. The heavy, thick fog of anesthesia slowly began to lift from my brain. I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital recovery room. My mouth felt as dry as sandpaper, and a dull, persistent throbbing radiated from my lower right leg. I tried to shift my weight on the stiff hospital mattress, but a sudden sharp jolt of pure white-hot agony shot straight up my shin. I gasped, my hands instantly gripping the cold metal rails of the bed. I looked down and saw my leg encased in a massive, thick plaster cast from my ankle all the way up to my mid-thigh. The orthopedic surgeon had told my father that the fracture was severe. The brutal force of Robert shoving me down those glass stairs had snapped my tibia completely in half. It required a grueling 3-hour emergency surgery, and they had to insert a long titanium rod and several heavy surgical screws straight into my bone just to hold my leg together. I closed my eyes, taking deep, slow breaths to ride out the wave of physical pain. The sterile smell of medical alcohol and bleached cotton sheets filled my nostrils. It was a stark contrast to the luxurious cologne and expensive leather of the executive suite where my entire marriage had violently ended just a few hours ago. The memories of the previous night rushed back into my mind with terrifying clarity. I remembered the sickening crack of my bone. I remembered the cold, arrogant laughter of the man I had loved for 5 years. I remembered the absolute terror on his face when the police sirens finally wailed outside his window. A warm, strong hand gently rested on my shoulder, pulling me out of my dark thoughts. I opened my eyes and turned my head. My father, William Harrison, was sitting quietly in a plain plastic visitor chair beside my bed. Even in this sterile clinical environment, he radiated an overwhelming aura of absolute power and quiet authority. He was wearing his signature charcoal gray tailored suit, not a single thread out of place, despite the fact that he had been awake all night coordinating my rescue and Robert's destruction. He looked at me, his sharp, observant eyes softening with a deep, profound fatherly love. He did not say a word at first. He just gently squeezed my shoulder, letting me know that I was completely safe. I took a shaky breath and managed to give him a small, tired smile. My father leaned forward and told me in a calm, even voice that the surgery had been a complete success. He explained that I would need months of physical therapy, but I was going to walk perfectly again. Then his voice hardened slightly, taking on the icy, calculating tone that had made him a legendary force on Wall Street. He told me that the federal agents had successfully secured all of Robert's servers and that the money laundering investigation was already moving at lightning speed. My father informed me that he had summoned his entire elite legal team. He told me that 4 of the most ruthless corporate litigators in the country were currently sitting in the private waiting area just down the hall, drafting the civil suits and asset recovery petitions. They were meticulously preparing to strip Robert of every single dime he had ever stolen from me. My father promised me that by the time his lawyers were finished, Robert would not even be able to afford a cup of coffee. I felt a massive wave of relief wash over my tired body. I thanked him, my voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. My father kissed my forehead and told me to rest. He said he needed to step out into the hallway for a few minutes to take a secure phone call from the federal prosecutor handling the wire fraud charges. He stood up, adjusted his suit jacket, and quietly walked out of the room, closing the heavy wooden door softly behind him. I lay back against the pillows, staring up at the white ceiling tiles. The painkillers the nurses had pumped into my IV line were making my head feel heavy and detached. I was just starting to drift back into a numb, painless sleep when the heavy wooden door to my room was suddenly and violently pushed open. The door slammed hard against the rubber wall stopper with a loud, echoing bang that made my heart leap in my chest. My mother-in-law, Martha, marched into the small hospital room like a raging storm. Even in the midst of a catastrophic family crisis, she looked as though she had just stepped out of a luxury fashion magazine. She was wearing a pristine cream-colored cashmere sweater, set expensive pearl earrings, and her perfectly highlighted blonde hair was styled immaculately. A heavy, suffocating cloud of her signature designer perfume immediately filled the cramped hospital room, completely masking the sterile scent of the medical supplies. Martha was a woman who practically worshipped social status. She was incredibly wealthy, deeply conservative, and she prided herself on having a completely flawless reputation among the elite circles of Boston. She spent her days organizing charity galas at the local country club and leading evening prayer groups at her massive upscale church. To Martha, public perception was absolute reality. She cared far more about what her wealthy neighbors thought of her than she cared about actual human decency. During my entire 5-year marriage to Robert, Martha had treated me with a thick layer of passive-aggressive disdain. Because Robert had lied and told her I came from a working-class background, she always viewed me as entirely beneath her family. She constantly made subtle, patronizing comments about my clothes, my career, and my background. At family dinners, she would boast endlessly about Robert's brilliant success, completely ignoring the fact that I was the one working 80-hour weeks to keep his company afloat. She believed her son was a flawless golden child, an untouchable genius who could do absolutely no wrong. Now that flawless golden child was sitting in a federal holding cell, facing decades in prison, and Martha was completely unraveling. She did not stop at the foot of my bed. She marched directly up to my side, her eyes wide and frantic. She did not even glance at the massive plaster cast, consuming my entire right leg. She did not notice the surgical drains or the heavy IV lines taped to my bruised hand. She was completely and utterly blind to the catastrophic physical trauma her son had inflicted upon me. Instead of asking how I was, she let out a loud theatrical gasp and threw her hands up into the air. "Sarah, what on earth have you done?" She shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the hard hospital walls. Her face was twisted into an ugly mask of outrage and panic. I lay completely silent, staring up at her, letting the sheer audacity of her opening statement hang heavily in the air. Martha began pacing frantically back and forth beside my bed, wringing her manicured hands together. She told me that the police had raided Robert's executive suite last night. She cried out that he had been dragged out of his own building in handcuffs in front of his entire staff and the local news crews. She demanded to know why I had called the authorities over a simple lover's quarrel. She actually called it a simple lover's quarrel. Her son had brutally shoved me down a flight of glass stairs, shattered my tibia in half, and laughed while I bled on the floor, and this wealthy, pious woman was calling it a minor domestic disagreement. Martha stopped pacing and moved closer to me, her breathing ragged. She leaned over my bed, her eyes filling with dramatic, forced tears. She began to play the ultimate victim, weaponizing her religion and her social status to try and bend me to her will. She cried that I was completely ruining his life. She told me that Robert was a good man, a brilliant executive who was just under a lot of pressure at work. She actually tried to justify his affair by saying that men have biological weaknesses and that it was my duty as a wife to guide him back to the right path instead of throwing him to the wolves. She raised her voice, talking about her precious reputation at the country club. She sobbed about how humiliated she was this morning when the other ladies at the church called her to ask why her son's picture was on the local morning news. She told me that the entire community was gossiping about her family and that I was the one responsible for dragging their respectable name through the mud. My jaw tightened. The heavy narcotics pumping through my veins could not dull the hot, burning fury rising rapidly in my chest. I watched this hypocritical woman standing over my broken body, crying tears of absolute selfishness. She did not shed a single tear for the daughter-in-law lying in a hospital bed with metal screws in her bones. She was only crying because her perfect country club facade had been shattered. Martha suddenly dropped dramatically to her knees right beside my bed. She clutched the edge of my white hospital blanket, bowing her head in a display of extreme theatrical desperation. She begged me to call the police and tell them I had made a terrible mistake. She pleaded with me to drop the aggravated assault charges. She told me to tell the federal agents that the money laundering accusations were just a massive misunderstanding. She swore that if I just dropped the case, Robert would come home, he would fire that awful girl Chloe, and we could go to marriage counseling to fix our family. She looked up at me, her mascara running slightly beneath her eyes, and delivered the ultimate guilt trip. She told me that our family had a pristine reputation to uphold. She said that men make mistakes, but a truly good Christian wife knows how to forgive and protect her husband. She demanded that I fulfill my vows and stop this madness before her son was sent away to prison. I stared down at Martha, kneeling on the linoleum floor. I listened to her manipulative, twisted logic. I looked at the expensive pearls resting against her neck and the incredibly expensive designer bag she had dropped onto the floor beside her knees. I felt the sharp, throbbing ache of the titanium rod permanently lodged inside my leg. The pure, unadulterated audacity of her demands echoed in the quiet room. She expected me to swallow my trauma, ignore my broken bones, and sacrifice my own financial future just to protect the public image of an abusive, lying monster. She honestly believed that her social standing at a local church was far more important than my physical safety and my stolen life savings. I did not scream at her. I did not cry. I simply let her finish her desperate, pathetic monologue. I lay there in silence, letting the tension build in the room as I gathered my strength. I looked at this woman who had belittled me for 5 years, and I realized exactly where Robert had learned his absolute lack of human empathy. I took a deep, slow breath, ignoring the pain in my leg, and prepared to deliver a reality check that would completely and permanently obliterate her perfect, wealthy illusion. The heavy, thick fog of anesthesia slowly began to lift from my tired brain. I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital recovery room, my vision swimming for a few seconds before finally snapping into sharp focus. My mouth felt as dry as sandpaper, and a dull, persistent throbbing radiated from my lower right leg. I tried to shift my weight on the stiff hospital mattress, but a sudden sharp jolt of pure white-hot agony shot straight up my shin. I gasped loudly, my hands instantly gripping the cold metal rails of the bed. I looked down and saw my leg encased in a massive thick plaster cast from my ankle all the way up to my mid-thigh. The orthopedic surgeon had told my father that the fracture was incredibly severe. The brutal force of Robert shoving me down those glass stairs had snapped my tibia completely in half. It required a grueling 3-hour emergency surgery, and the medical team had to insert a long titanium rod and several heavy surgical screws straight into my bone just to hold my leg together. I closed my eyes, taking deep, slow breaths to ride out the intense wave of physical pain. The sterile smell of medical alcohol and bleached cotton sheets filled my nostrils. It was a stark, absolute contrast to the luxurious designer cologne and expensive Italian leather of the executive suite where my entire marriage had violently ended just a few hours ago. The memories of the previous night rushed back into my mind with terrifying clarity. I remembered the sickening crack of my bone echoing in the silent office. I remembered the cold, arrogant laughter of the man I had loved and supported for 5 long years. I remembered the absolute terror on his face when the police sirens finally wailed outside his window, signaling the total destruction of the empire he had built on my back. A warm, strong hand gently rested on my shoulder, pulling me out of my dark, exhausting thoughts. I opened my eyes and turned my head. My father, William Harrison, was sitting quietly in a plain plastic visitor chair beside my bed. Even in this sterile clinical environment, he radiated an overwhelming aura of absolute power and quiet authority. He was wearing his signature charcoal gray tailored suit, not a single thread out of place, despite the fact that he had been awake all night coordinating my medical rescue and Robert's legal annihilation. He looked at me, his sharp, observant eyes softening with a deep, profound fatherly love. He did not say a word at first. He just gently squeezed my shoulder, letting me know that I was completely safe. I took a shaky breath and managed to give him a small, tired smile. My father leaned forward and told me in a calm, even voice that the surgery had been a complete success. He explained that I would need months of difficult physical therapy, but I was going to walk perfectly again. Then his voice hardened slightly, taking on the icy, calculating tone that had made him a legendary feared force on Wall Street. He told me that the federal agents had successfully secured all of Robert's servers and that the money laundering investigation was already moving at lightning speed. My father informed me that he had summoned his entire elite legal team. He told me that 4 of the most ruthless corporate litigators in the country were currently sitting in the private waiting area just down the hall, drafting the civil suits and asset recovery petitions. They were meticulously preparing to strip Robert of every single dime he had ever stolen. I felt a massive wave of psychological relief wash over my tired body. I thanked him, my voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. My father kissed my forehead and told me to rest. He said he needed to step out into the hallway for a few minutes to take a secure phone call from the federal prosecutor handling the wire fraud charges. He stood up, adjusted his suit jacket, and quietly walked out of the room, closing the heavy wooden door softly behind him. I lay back against the pillows, staring up at the white ceiling tiles. The painkillers the nurses had pumped into my intravenous line were making my head feel heavy and detached. I was just starting to drift back into a numb, painless sleep when the heavy wooden door to my room was suddenly and violently pushed open. The door slammed hard against the rubber wall stopper with a loud echoing bang that made my heart leap in my chest. My mother-in-law Martha marched into the small hospital room like a raging, chaotic storm. Even in the midst of a catastrophic family crisis, she looked as though she had just stepped out of a luxury fashion magazine. She was a wealthy, affluent, deeply conservative woman who practically worshipped social status. She was wearing a pristine cream-colored cashmere sweater, set expensive pearl earrings, and her perfectly highlighted blonde hair was styled immaculately. A heavy, suffocating cloud of her signature designer floral perfume immediately filled the cramped hospital room, completely masking the sterile scent of the medical supplies. Martha was a woman who prided herself on having a completely flawless reputation among the elite circles of Boston. She spent her days organizing high society charity galas at the local country club and leading evening prayer groups at her massive upscale church. To Martha, public perception was absolute reality. She cared far more about what her wealthy neighbors thought of her than she cared about actual human decency or compassion. During my entire 5-year marriage to Robert, Martha had treated me with a thick layer of passive-aggressive disdain. Because Robert had lied and told her I came from a working-class background, she always viewed me as entirely beneath her family. She constantly made subtle, patronizing comments about my clothes, my career, and my background at family dinners. She would boast endlessly about Robert's brilliant success, completely ignoring the fact that I was the one working 80-hour weeks to keep his company afloat. She believed her son was a flawless golden child, an untouchable genius who could do absolutely no wrong. Now that flawless golden child was sitting in a federal holding cell, facing decades in prison, and Martha was completely unraveling. She did not stop at the foot of my bed. She marched directly up to my side, her eyes wide and frantic. She did not even glance at the massive plaster cast consuming my entire right leg. She did not notice the surgical drains or the heavy intravenous lines taped to my bruised hand. She was completely and utterly blind to the catastrophic physical trauma her son had inflicted upon me just hours prior. Instead of asking how I was, she let out a loud theatrical gasp and threw her hands up into the air. "Sarah, what on earth have you done to my family?" She shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the hard hospital walls. Her face was twisted into an ugly mask of outrage and panic. I lay completely silent, staring up at her, letting the sheer audacity of her opening statement hang heavily in the air. Martha began pacing frantically back and forth beside my bed, wringing her manicured hands together. She told me that the police had raided Robert's executive suite last night. She cried out that he had been dragged out of his own building in handcuffs in front of his entire staff and the local news crews. She demanded to know why I had called the authorities over a simple lover's quarrel. She actually called it a simple lover's quarrel. Her son had brutally shoved me down a flight of glass stairs, shattered my tibia in half, and laughed while I bled on the floor, and this wealthy, pious woman was calling it a minor domestic disagreement. Martha stopped pacing and moved closer to me, her breathing ragged. She leaned over my bed, her eyes filling with dramatic forced tears. She began to play the ultimate victim, weaponizing her religion and her social status to try and bend me to her will. She cried that I was completely ruining his life and destroying her social standing. She told me that Robert was a good man, a brilliant executive who was just under a lot of pressure at work. She actually tried to justify his affair by saying that men have biological weaknesses and that it was my duty as a wife to guide him back to the right path instead of throwing him to the wolves. She raised her voice, talking about her precious reputation at the country club. She sobbed about how humiliated she was this morning when the other ladies at the church called her to ask why her son's picture was on the local morning news broadcast. She told me that the entire community was gossiping about her family and that I was the one responsible for dragging their respectable name through the mud. Martha suddenly dropped dramatically to her knees right beside my bed. She clutched the edge of my white hospital blanket, bowing her head in a display of extreme theatrical desperation. She begged me to call the police and tell them I had made a terrible mistake. She pleaded with me to drop the aggravated assault charges. She told me to tell the federal agents that the money laundering accusations were just a massive misunderstanding. She swore that if I just dropped the case, Robert would come home, he would fire that awful girl Chloe, and we could go to marriage counseling to fix our broken family. She looked up at me, her expensive mascara running slightly beneath her eyes, and delivered the ultimate guilt trip. "Sarah, you are ruining his life." She cried, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. "Our family has a spotless reputation in the community. Men make mistakes, but a good Christian wife knows how to forgive and protect her husband. You must stop this madness before he goes to prison." The pure, unadulterated audacity of her demands echoed in the quiet room. She expected me to swallow my extreme physical trauma, ignore my broken bones, and sacrifice my own financial future just to protect the public image of an abusive, lying monster. She honestly believed that her social standing at a local church was far more important than my safety and my stolen life savings. I did not scream at her. I did not cry. I simply let her finish her desperate, pathetic monologue. I lay there in silence, letting the tension build in the room as I gathered my strength. I looked at this woman who had belittled me for 5 years, and I realized exactly where Robert had learned his absolute lack of human empathy. I looked down at Martha, kneeling on the cold linoleum floor of my hospital room. The heavy narcotics pumping through my line did absolutely nothing to dull the burning fire of clarity in my mind. I did not feel any pity for the tears ruining her makeup. I only felt a cold, profound disgust for her absolute hypocrisy. "You are asking me to forgive him, Martha," I said, my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any emotion. "You're asking me to protect your family reputation and drop the charges against a man who brutally shoved me down a flight of stairs and left me to bleed out on his office floor." Martha sniffled loudly, dramatically, wiping her eyes with the lace handkerchief she pulled from her designer handbag. She nodded her head rapidly, telling me again that grace is the ultimate virtue of a woman. Every word out of her mouth was a calculated weapon designed to manipulate my empathy. But she had no idea that I had spent the last 3 months meticulously peeling back the layers of her son's financial crimes. And in doing so, I had completely peeled back the layers of her own fraudulent life. I slowly reached over to the rolling bedside table next to my right arm. My father had left a thick, heavy manila folder sitting right on top of my water pitcher. It was the master audit file, the exact same dossier that the federal agents were currently using to tear Robert's empire down to the studs. My fingers gripped the thick stack of paper. Despite the agonizing throbbing in my leg, I lifted the heavy folder and threw it directly onto my lap. It landed with a loud, heavy thud right in front of Martha's tear-stained face. She flinched, pulling her hands back from my bed as if the paper had physically burned her. "Open it, Martha," I commanded, my voice echoing sharply off the sterile walls of the hospital room. Take a good hard look at the pristine reputation you are begging me to protect. Martha looked from the folder to my face, her dramatic crying suddenly faltering. She reached out with trembling fingers and flipped open the heavy cover. The first page was a master ledger highlighted with bright red ink, detailing a series of massive wire transfers. I did not give her a chance to act confused. I read the numbers out loud to her. I told her that for the past 2 years, Robert had been systematically siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from the company pension fund. He was not just stealing from the wealthy institutional investors. He was robbing the retirement savings of the administrative assistants, the janitorial staff, and the hardworking employees who trusted him with their futures. And do you know exactly where that stolen pension money went, Martha? I asked, leaning forward into the pain of my broken leg to make sure she heard every single syllable. It went directly into your personal bank accounts. It paid for your exclusive platinum membership at the country club. It paid off the remaining balance of the massive mortgage on your beautiful, pristine estate in the suburbs. It funded your luxury charity galas and your expensive cashmere sweaters. Every single time you stood up in your church and bragged about your wonderful, successful son, you were doing it while wearing clothes bought with money stolen from working-class families. The blood completely drained from Martha's face. Her jaw dropped open, and the lace handkerchief fluttered from her fingers, landing uselessly on the hospital floor. The righteous, pious mother playing the victim was instantly gone. In her place was a terrified woman staring at the undeniable proof of her own horrific complicity. She stammered frantically, trying to formulate a defense. She claimed she had absolutely no idea where the money came from. She swore Robert told her his business was just doing incredibly well and that he wanted to spoil his mother. But the sheer panic in her eyes completely betrayed the truth. She knew. She had always known Robert was living far beyond his legitimate means, but she had eagerly looked the other way because the money kept flowing and her social status kept rising. You are a massive fraud, Martha, I told her coldly, and your reputation is already completely dead. You just do not know it yet. Before Martha could scream or deny my accusations, the heavy wooden door to my hospital room slowly pushed open again. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. My father, William Harrison, stepped smoothly back into the room. He did not look angry. He did not look rushed. He possessed the terrifying absolute calm of a man who had already won the war before the enemy even realized the battle had begun. He stood tall in his tailored charcoal suit, adjusting his cuffs as he looked down at Martha kneeling pitifully on the floor. Please, Martha, do get up off the floor. My father said, his deep, resonant voice filling the room with an absolute unyielding authority. The hospital cleaning staff works far too hard to have you wiping the linoleum with your expensive clothes. Martha scrambled clumsily to her feet, her designer handbag slipping awkwardly from her shoulder. She looked at my father, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She had always been intimidated by him, but she never truly understood who he was until this exact terrifying moment. She tried to muster a polite society smile, but her lips were trembling so violently she could barely close her mouth. William, she started, her voice high and breathless. William, please. You have to talk some sense into Sarah. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. We are family. We need to handle this privately. My father did not smile. He walked over to the foot of my bed, placing himself firmly between me and my former mother-in-law like an impenetrable fortress of solid steel. We are not family, Martha, my father said smoothly. We are opposing parties in a massive federal criminal investigation. And I am afraid your son's legal troubles are the absolute least of your concerns right now. Martha took a shaky step backward, her back pressing flat against the cold wall of the hospital room. What do you mean? She gasped, her hands hovering nervously near her throat. My father gestured toward the open audit file sitting on my lap. He informed her with chilling precision that his team of top-tier corporate litigators had just finished reviewing the comprehensive financial dossier I had compiled. He told her that because Robert had transferred stolen pension funds directly into her personal checking accounts, she was no longer just an innocent bystander. She was an active beneficiary of grand larceny. My father looked her straight in the eye and delivered the absolute killing blow. My legal team is currently filing a massive civil suit against you for receiving stolen corporate assets. He stated, his voice as cold as ice. By tomorrow morning, every single one of your bank accounts will be completely frozen by a federal judge. Your precious country club estate is going to be seized as collateral to repay the employees your son robbed. You are going to lose the house, the cars, the memberships, and every last ounce of your stolen wealth. Martha's eyes widened to the size of saucers. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish, suffocating on dry land. The absolute crushing reality of her impending poverty hit her like a speeding freight train. She realized she was not just losing her son to the federal prison system. She was losing her entire identity. She was going to be publicly humiliated, stripped of her wealth, and cast out of the elite circles she had spent her entire life desperately climbing. Her perfect, flawless reputation was turning to dust right before her terrified eyes. With no other cards left to play, and absolutely no way to manipulate her way out of the corner she was trapped in, Martha resorted to the only pathetic defense mechanism she had left. She let out a loud, dramatic wail through the back of her hand against her forehead and deliberately let her knees buckle beneath her. She collapsed onto the floor in a completely manufactured fainting spell, hoping the display of fragile feminine weakness would stop my father's ruthless legal assault. She lay there on the linoleum, her eyes fluttering shut, waiting for a team of doctors to rush in and shower her with sympathy. But my father simply looked down at her with an expression of profound boredom. He did not call for a nurse. He did not ask if she was okay. He casually reached into his suit pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed the hospital security desk. "Yes, this is William Harrison in room 412. My father said calmly into the phone. "There is a woman trespassing in my daughter's recovery room. She appears to be having some sort of theatrical episode on the floor. Please send your team to escort her off the premises immediately." Less than a minute later, 2 large, burly hospital security guards entered the room. Martha, realizing her dramatic fainting act was a complete failure, suddenly opened her eyes and scrambled to her feet. She tried to regain her dignity, brushing off her cashmere sweater and grabbing her designer bag, but the guards did not give her a single chance to speak. They firmly grabbed her by the arms and unceremoniously marched her out of the room. She shrieked indignantly, demanding they unhand her, screaming about her rights and her reputation as they dragged her down the sterile white hallway. I listened to her shrill voice fade away into the distance, leaving my hospital room completely quiet once again. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. I looked at my father, and for the first time since my leg had been shattered, a genuine feeling of profound peace washed over my exhausted body. The righteous, pious woman who had tormented me for 5 years was finally going to face the absolute devastation she deserved. Chloe did not even last 24 hours in federal custody. She was a legal director, which meant she possessed exactly enough knowledge of the federal justice system to understand that she was completely and utterly doomed. When the federal agents placed her in the sterile, windowless interrogation room at the field office, she did not ask for a glass of water. She did not ask to call her family. She immediately demanded a pen, a pad of yellow legal paper, and a federal prosecutor who was officially authorized to negotiate a plea deal. Chloe knew the unspoken golden rule of federal conspiracy charges. The first person to flip gets the life raft and everyone else gets dragged to the bottom of the ocean. She had spent the last year sleeping with my husband, wearing expensive designer clothes purchased with stolen money, and acting like she was the untouchable queen of the corporate world. But the absolute second she heard the heavy metal door of the interrogation room click shut, all of her fake romantic loyalty to Robert completely vanished into thin air. She threw him under the bus with a speed and efficiency that was honestly breathtaking. I read the transcript of her statement later, and it was a masterclass in manipulative self-preservation. The federal agents had barely placed the heavy red folders of printed bank statements on the metal table before she started talking. Chloe painted herself as a naive, impressionable young woman who had been ruthlessly coerced by a powerful, manipulative chief executive officer. She wept loudly and dramatically in front of the federal investigators. She claimed that Robert had threatened to completely ruin her entire legal career if she did not comply with his financial demands. She swore up and down that he was the sole mastermind behind the entire money laundering operation. According to Chloe, she had absolutely no idea the money used to buy her luxury penthouse in the Seaport district was stolen from the company pension fund. She played the role of the terrified, helpless victim so perfectly that you would almost forget she was the one happily drafting and signing the fraudulent wire transfers. To sweeten her deal, Chloe handed over absolutely everything. She gave the federal investigators the direct decryption keys to Robert's private servers. She provided the exact routing numbers for the offshore shell companies located in the Cayman Islands. She even surrendered the hidden backup passwords to his personal cryptocurrency wallets. She completely and systematically dismantled the man she supposedly loved, trading his entire future for a formal recommendation of leniency on her own sentencing. While Chloe was busy singing like a canary in a comfortable air-conditioned interrogation room, Robert was experiencing the harsh, unforgiving reality of a federal holding cell. For a man who had spent his entire adult life obsessing over luxury wealth and public status, the sheer physical degradation of federal lockup was a waking psychological nightmare. There were no imported Italian leather sofas to sit on. There were no floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the beautiful Boston Harbor. There was only the overwhelming stench of cheap bleach, stale sweat, and institutional soap. He was forced to trade his bespoke, custom-tailored suit for a scratchy, stiff, oversized orange jumpsuit. He sat alone on a rigid metal bench, surrounded by the loud, chaotic noise of common criminals, shivering in the freezing air of the detention center. He honestly believed he could still talk his way out of it. Robert possessed a level of malignant narcissism that made him genuinely think he was the smartest person on the planet. He paced back and forth in his cell, demanding to speak to the warden as if he were a dissatisfied premium customer at a luxury hotel. The guards simply laughed at him and ignored his arrogant demands. He waited anxiously for his high-priced defense attorney to arrive, fully expecting a swift bail hearing and a smooth return to his comfortable, affluent life. He thought his lawyers would find a clever legal loophole. He thought he could easily intimidate the federal prosecutors with his corporate bravado. He still believed he had money and leverage hidden away in encrypted places my father's forensic accountants could not possibly reach. But when his defense attorney finally walked into the visitor area of the detention center later that afternoon, Robert's last remaining delusion was brutally shattered. The attorney did not bring a favorable bail agreement. He brought a massive stack of federal indictments and a face as pale as a ghost. The attorney sat down across from Robert behind the thick plexiglass partition and delivered the catastrophic news. He explained that the Securities and Exchange Commission had permanently frozen every single corporate and personal account linked to Robert's name. He explained that the devastating civil suits filed by my father's elite legal team had completely paralyzed Robert's ability to liquidate any physical assets. And then the attorney delivered the ultimate killing blow. He looked Robert straight in the eye and told him that Chloe had officially signed a proffer agreement to turn state's evidence against him. The psychological collapse that followed was absolute and complete. Robert had built his entire fragile ego on the deeply held belief that he was a brilliant, irresistible kingmaker. He had callously discarded me, his fiercely loyal wife of 5 years, because he believed Chloe was his true intellectual equal. He thought she was his brilliant partner in crime who truly understood his grand corporate vision. Hearing that his precious intellectual equal had sold him to the federal government for a reduced sentence completely broke his brain. The young, beautiful woman he had destroyed our marriage for had not hesitated for a single solitary second to throw him to the wolves to save her own skin. He was entirely alone. The realization hit him with the catastrophic force of a speeding train. He had absolutely no money, no loyal allies, no accessible legal defense fund, and no hope. He was a cornered rat facing 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The sheer gravity of his situation crushed the air from his lungs. The untouchable chief executive officer was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken man sitting in an orange jumpsuit. I was lying quietly in my hospital recovery bed, staring out the window at the dark gray Boston sky. The heavy plaster cast on my right leg was an agonizing, constant reminder of the violence I had endured, but my mind had never felt more incredibly peaceful. My father had just left the room to finalize the asset seizure paperwork with his attorneys. The quiet, steady hum of the heart monitor and the soft dripping of my intravenous fluids were the only sounds in the private room. Then the hospital telephone resting on the rolling bedside table began to ring. It was a sharp, jarring sound that cut through the tranquil atmosphere. I slowly reached over with my bruised hand and picked up the receiver, pressing the cool plastic against my ear. An automated, robotic female voice immediately filled the line. "You have a collect call from a federal inmate at the Suffolk County Detention Center. To accept this call, press 1. I paused for a moment. A cold, deeply calculating smile spread slowly across my face. I reached down and firmly pressed the number 1 on the keypad. "Sarah." Robert's voice burst frantically through the speaker. It was not the smooth, commanding baritone of a confident chief executive officer. It was the frantic, high-pitched, ragged voice of a man who was completely and utterly drowning. "Sarah, please, you have to listen to me. You have to help me right now." I did not say a single word. I just let him listen to the total, absolute silence on my end of the line, letting the heavy, oppressive weight of his catastrophic failure sink deep into his bones. "Sarah, please do not hang up on me." He begged, his breathing fast and heavily panicked. The audio quality was terrible, crackling with static, but I could easily hear the sheer primal terror vibrating in his throat. "This is all a massive, terrible mistake. You have to talk to your father for me. You have to tell him to call off his lawyers immediately. They are freezing absolutely everything. They are completely ruining my life. I am sleeping on a freezing concrete floor, Sarah. You know I do not belong in a terrible place like this." The pure, unadulterated selfishness of his desperate plea was almost comical. He was not calling to apologize for violently shattering my leg. He was not calling to express deep remorse for stealing my entire life's savings and betraying my trust. He was calling because he was physically uncomfortable, because his delicate, arrogant sensibilities were highly offended by the harsh reality of a federal prison cell. He honestly believed that after everything he had done to destroy me, I would still obediently step in and save him from his own actions. I remained completely silent, staring out the window at the clouds, letting him dig his own grave deeper and deeper with every word. When I did not respond to his initial pleas, his panic rapidly escalated into rapid, desperate bargaining. He completely abandoned his attempts to appeal to my emotions and resorted to the only language he truly understood, the language of transactional wealth. "Listen to me, Sarah. I will give you absolutely everything." He promised, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic, terrified rush. "I know you are furious about Chloe. I know I made a terrible mistake, but she betrayed me. She's a lying, manipulative snake, and I see that now. She stabbed me in the back. I am completely done with her. If you just get your father to drop the civil suits and unlock the corporate accounts, I will walk away from it all. I will give you the primary house in Brookline. I will give you the luxury cars. I will sign over the entire company to your name. You can have every single asset I own, Sarah. Just please get me out of here. I cannot survive in this place for another night." I gripped the plastic telephone receiver tightly in my hand. I looked down at the heavy surgical screws protruding slightly beneath my thick white plaster cast. I remembered the exact cruel look on his face when he stood at the top of the glass stairs laughing out loud at my agonizing pain. He had looked down at me bleeding on the floor and told me that without him, I was a total nobody. He had smugly told me that he owned absolutely everything and that I would end up sleeping on the street if I tried to fight him. Now he was literally begging for his life over a monitored prison phone line, frantically trying to bribe me with the very assets he had stolen from me in the first place. He was trying to negotiate a high-stakes legal settlement using monopoly money that he no longer possessed. "Robert," I finally spoke. My voice was incredibly calm, entirely flat, and completely devoid of any sympathy or emotion. It was the absolute terrifying tone of a woman who had successfully and permanently excised a toxic tumor from her life. He stopped rambling instantly, holding his breath, desperately waiting in the silence for me to offer him a lifeline. "You really do not understand the reality of the situation you're in, do you?" I said, slowly enunciating every single word, letting the cold reality of my statement freeze his blood over the phone line. "You are trying to negotiate with corporate assets that simply no longer exist." "What do you mean?" He stammered, his voice dropping to a terrified, trembling whisper. "The house is worth millions of dollars. The company has immense operational value. I am offering you a massive fortune, Sarah. You just have to make the call." "You do not own a fortune, Robert," I replied smoothly, feeling an incredible surge of vindication. "You are completely and totally bankrupt. The primary bank initiated a full legal foreclosure on the house in Brookline at exactly 9 o'clock this morning because the mortgage was secured by fraudulent corporate funds. You do not own the luxury cars because the federal agents seized them directly from the office parking garage last night under the Asset Forfeiture Act. And as for the company you are so generously offering to sign over to me, my father's private equity firm already executed a hostile corporate takeover of the board of directors at dawn. I do not need you to give me the company, Robert. I already own it. The silence on the other end of the phone line was absolute and profound. I could almost hear the remaining fragile fragments of his shattered ego turning completely to dust. He was completely out of moves. He had absolutely nothing left to offer, nothing left to threaten me with, and nothing left to bargain with. The crushing realization that he was totally powerless finally washed over him, leaving him completely paralyzed in his cell. You told me that without you, I would walk away with absolutely nothing. I continued my voice, steady, resonant, and entirely victorious. You looked at me and told me I was just a glorified secretary who pushed papers around. But the absolute truth is, Robert, you were only ever a king because I allowed you to wear the crown. And now I have taken it back. Sarah, please. He whimpered, the sound breaking into a pathetic, broken, breathless sob. Please, I have absolutely nothing left. I am begging you to help me. Enjoy the concrete floor, Robert, I said coldly. I did not wait for his desperate response. I pulled the plastic receiver away from my ear and firmly placed it back onto the cradle. The sharp, decisive click of the phone disconnecting echoed loudly in the quiet hospital room, sounding exactly like the final definitive slamming of a heavy steel door locking forever. The satisfying click of the hospital telephone receiver hitting the plastic cradle echoed loudly in the quiet, sterile room. I leaned back against the stiff white pillows, taking a long, deep, cleansing breath of the purified air. Robert was completely broken, sitting alone on a cold concrete floor in a county detention center, entirely stripped of his stolen wealth and his false dignity. He had called me begging for mercy, offering me assets he no longer owned, entirely unaware that the trap I had set for him had already snapped shut with lethal precision. But my work was not entirely finished just yet. There was still one more vital loose end that needed to be permanently tied up. Chloe, the arrogant 28-year-old legal director who had sneered at my broken body just hours ago, was currently sitting in a stark, windowless federal interrogation room downtown, fighting tooth and nail to save her own skin. She honestly believed she was about to walk away scot-free. Chloe was a highly educated attorney, which meant she understood the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of federal conspiracy cases better than anyone. She knew the absolute golden rule of white-collar criminal defense. The very first person to offer a full confession and flip on their partner gets the coveted immunity deal, while absolutely everyone else goes to a maximum security prison for a very long time. As soon as the federal agents had escorted her into the heavily guarded field office, she had immediately filed paperwork to turn state's evidence against Robert. She painted a tragic, heartbreaking, completely fabricated picture of herself as a young, naive professional who had been completely overpowered by a manipulative, older, predatory chief executive officer. She cried real heavy tears. She trembled visibly in her expensive silk blouse. She claimed Robert was the sole evil mastermind behind the entire money laundering operation and the offshore shell companies. She swore under oath that she only signed the fraudulent wire transfers because Robert had aggressively threatened to destroy her legal career and ruin her life if she refused to comply with his demands. She thought her theatrical performance was absolutely flawless. She thought she had successfully shifted 100% of the criminal blame onto Robert, leaving herself completely untouchable and legally pristine. She assumed that I was nothing more than an angry, jealous, scorned wife who had simply stumbled upon a few incriminating paper bank statements by pure accident. She assumed my father, despite his immense Wall Street power and incredible influence, only possessed the basic financial documents I had printed out that fateful Tuesday evening. Chloe thought she was the smartest person in the room, holding all the legal cards, confidently drinking terrible break-room coffee in the federal building while she waited for the gullible prosecutors to finalize her full immunity agreement. But Chloe had made the exact same catastrophic, life-ruining miscalculation that Robert had made. She completely and utterly underestimated me. She forgot that I was the senior operations manager of the firm. I did not just handle standard payroll and basic human resources. I personally built the entire digital infrastructure of that company from the ground up. I purchased the massive physical servers. I set up the highly encrypted firewalls. I implemented the daily automated data backup protocols that kept the firm running smoothly and securely. I knew every single digital backdoor, every hidden file path, and every deleted server log. And most importantly, I had spent the last 3 months quietly, meticulously, and methodically dismantling their entire digital lives. Before that freezing Tuesday evening, when I confronted them in Robert's office before he violently shoved me down the glass stairs and shattered my right leg, I had not just been looking at basic paper bank statements. I had been sitting in the quiet, dim glow of the restricted archives room, running a deep, highly comprehensive digital forensic recovery on the firm's master servers. When Chloe and Robert thought they were being incredibly clever by permanently deleting their email chains and wiping their local hard drives to cover their tracks, they had absolutely no idea that my master administrative security clearance automatically created ghost copies of every single keystroke they made. Every deleted file, every hidden message, and every secret transaction was safely stored in a secure digital vault that only I could access. While I was lying in my hospital bed recovering from my grueling orthopedic surgery, my father's elite legal team was not just handing over the basic financial records to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They were handing over a highly encrypted, massive external hard drive that I had carefully hidden inside my locked desk drawer weeks ago. That heavy digital drive contained the complete, unedited, perfectly recovered server logs from Chloe's personal executive workstation. The federal prosecutors did not need to rely on Chloe's tearful manufactured confession to build their case. They had the cold, hard, indisputable digital truth, and the truth was absolutely devastating for her. The recovered server logs proved without a single shadow of a doubt that Chloe was never coerced into doing anything. She was not a helpless victim manipulated by a powerful boss. She was the primary calculating architect of the entire illegal financial operation. The recovered files clearly showed that Chloe was the one who had researched and established the complex offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. She was the one who had drafted the fake vendor invoices to seamlessly siphon money out of the corporate operating accounts. She had used her specialized, sophisticated legal knowledge to deliberately structure the massive wire transfers in a specific way that bypassed the standard banking security triggers and avoided federal oversight. Robert might have been the arrogant, loud face of the operation, but Chloe was the meticulous, greedy, silent brain driving the massive fraud forward. But the absolute best part of the entire digital dossier, the specific piece of undeniable evidence that truly sealed her ultimate fate, was a hidden, heavily encrypted folder I had found buried deep within her personal cloud storage drive. Chloe was not just stealing money from the firm alongside Robert. She was actively, aggressively preparing to steal the money directly from Robert. The recovered forensic files revealed that Chloe had secretly established a separate, highly secure offshore cryptocurrency wallet that Robert knew absolutely nothing about. She had been quietly siphoning large percentages of the embezzled funds from their joint offshore accounts and moving them directly into her own private digital vault. She was slowly bleeding him dry right under his arrogant nose. Furthermore, I had successfully recovered digital electronic receipts for a one-way first-class plane ticket to a non-extradition country in Eastern Europe. The ticket was booked entirely under a fake, untraceable alias she had legally established months ago using stolen client identification information. The departure date on that specific airline ticket was scheduled for exactly 3 weeks from now. Chloe had never planned to build a life with Robert. She had never planned to live happily ever after in the $1 million seaport condominium he bought her. She had been playing him perfectly the entire time. Her ultimate master goal was to drain his remaining corporate accounts, transfer the entire stolen fortune into her untraceable cryptocurrency wallet, and disappear across the globe in the middle of the night. She was going to leave Robert completely bankrupt, totally blindsided, and holding the massive bag for the severe federal crimes they committed together. I can only imagine The sheer unadulterated shock and horror on Chloe's face when the lead federal prosecutor walked confidently back into her small interrogation room. She was probably sitting there, tapping her perfectly manicured fingers on the metal table, eagerly waiting to sign her immunity paperwork and walk out into the fresh Boston air as a free woman. Instead, the seasoned prosecutor dropped a massive heavy stack of printed server logs directly onto the metal table right in front of her face. He did not offer her a glass of water. He did not offer her an immunity deal or a plea bargain. He simply showed her the recovered timestamped emails where she actively commanded Robert to authorize the fraudulent financial transfers. He showed her the precise digital blueprints of the offshore accounts she had personally designed. And then he showed her the printed electronic receipt for her secret one-way ticket to Europe. In a matter of agonizing seconds, Chloe's entire carefully constructed legal defense completely and spectacularly imploded. Her false manufactured tears instantly dried up rapidly, replaced by a cold, suffocating wave of absolute terror. She realized that she could not play the innocent victim anymore. The federal government knew exactly who she really was. They knew she was a massive flight risk. They knew she was a highly calculating, incredibly dangerous white-collar criminal who had weaponized her prestigious law license to orchestrate a massive financial conspiracy. The federal prosecutor did not just reject her desperate offer to turn state's evidence, he aggressively and ruthlessly escalated the criminal charges against both of them. Because Chloe and Robert had systematically conspired together over a long period of time to commit large-scale wire fraud, launder stolen corporate money across international borders, and deliberately defraud wealthy institutional investors. The federal prosecutor decided to drop the ultimate legal hammer. He officially slapped both Robert Evans and Chloe with severe violations under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, a devastating legal maneuver universally known as RICO charges. A RICO charge is the absolute worst possible nightmare for any white-collar criminal. It meant the federal government was prosecuting them not just as individual people who made a simple financial mistake, but as a highly coordinated, extremely dangerous criminal syndicate. It meant mandatory minimum sentences of 20 long years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. It meant the immediate, irreversible seizure of absolutely every single asset they owned, regardless of whether it was purchased with clean money or dirty money. Their entire lives were officially forfeited to the state. By hitting them both simultaneously with massive RICO indictments, the federal prosecutor effectively locked Robert and Chloe into the ultimate inescapable prisoner's dilemma. They were both placed in separate, heavily guarded holding cells, deep within the federal detention center, completely isolated from the outside world and permanently separated from each other. Robert now knew, thanks to the prosecutors, that Chloe had tried to eagerly sell him out to the federal agents within minutes of her initial arrest. He also knew, thanks to his own furious, highly paid defense attorney, that Chloe had secretly plotted to steal all of his remaining hidden money and completely abandon him to face the devastating legal consequences entirely alone. The beautiful younger woman he had violently destroyed his marriage for had planned to leave him completely bankrupt and rotting in a dark prison cell while she lived a life of total luxury on a sunny beach in Eastern Europe. Chloe, on the other hand, knew that Robert was currently sitting in a concrete cell nearby, completely consumed by a violent, vengeful, unpredictable rage. She knew that Robert would absolutely use every single breath he had left in his body to eagerly testify against her. She knew he would do everything in his power to ensure she suffered the maximum possible federal penalty for her ultimate betrayal. They could no longer coordinate their legal defenses. They could no longer protect each other from the massive weight of the federal government. They were two cornered, highly desperate animals forced into a tiny digital cage, fully prepared to completely tear each other to shreds in a pathetic, useless attempt to save their own lives. But it did not matter what they said or what they did anymore. The federal government had absolutely all the digital proof they needed to secure airtight, permanent convictions for both of them. They were completely and totally trapped in a blazing hell of their own making, bound tightly together by their insatiable greed and ultimately destroyed by their own mutual treachery. Lying quietly in my hospital bed, I looked over at the beautiful, vibrant bouquet of fresh flowers my father had ordered for my room. The bright, cheerful colors were a sharp, lovely contrast to the dark, ugly reality that Robert and Chloe were currently facing in their concrete cells. I had spent 5 long years of my life shrinking myself down to fit into Robert's fragile, insecure, demanding world. I had hidden my true powerful identity, sacrificed my own personal happiness, and literally broken my own bones just to appease an arrogant man who never truly valued me. But I was no longer that quiet, obedient, suffering wife. I was a highly capable woman who had meticulously orchestrated the total, absolute annihilation of the greedy people who had tried to violently destroy me. I had used my sharp intelligence, my extensive professional skills, and my unyielding determination to secure my own ultimate justice. Robert thought he could throw me away like garbage and walk into the sunset with his brilliant younger mistress. Chloe thought she could easily outsmart the law and safely escape with a massive stolen fortune. But in the bitter end, they were both sitting in freezing concrete cells facing decades behind heavy steel bars, completely stripped of their stolen wealth, their prestigious careers, and their freedom. The federal prosecutors would spend the next year building a massive, insurmountable, absolutely perfect case against them, but the true victory had already been won tonight. The toxic poison had been completely excised from my life. As the heavy medication finally pulled me down into a deep, restful, completely painless sleep, a quiet, genuine smile settled softly on my face. The terrible storm was finally over, the villains had been totally vanquished, and I was exactly where I was always meant to be. The federal judge, presiding over the sweeping racketeering case, set an absolutely astronomical bail for my husband. Considering the sheer magnitude of the wire fraud charges, the existence of international shell companies, and the undeniable flight risk he posed, the court demanded a staggering $5 million for his temporary release. Robert sat in his freezing, windowless concrete holding cell, completely stripped of his bespoke suits and his arrogant corporate bravado. He was utterly cut off from his stolen wealth, heavily reliant on the one person foolish enough to still believe in his absolute innocence, his mother Martha. Despite the glaring, undeniable audit files I had thrown directly into her lap just days prior, despite the looming civil suits threatening to seize her own personal bank accounts, Martha remained completely blinded by a profound maternal delusion. She possessed an incredibly stubborn, deeply arrogant belief that her golden child was simply the victim of a massive misunderstanding. Desperate to protect her precious family reputation, she contacted a high-risk bail bondsman. To secure Robert's immediate release from federal custody, Martha legally pledged the entire remaining equity of her pristine, perfectly manicured country club estate in the affluent suburbs. She literally gambled the expensive roof over her head, completely convinced that her brilliant son would miraculously clear his name and restore their glorious social standing in the community. Robert walked out of the Suffolk County Detention Center 48 hours later. He was no longer the untouchable chief executive officer. He walked out wearing cheap, ill-fitting clothes purchased from a local discount store, looking nervously over his shoulder at every passing car. The sweet taste of temporary freedom was heavily tainted by the crushing, undeniable reality of his situation. Robert had absolutely no intention of staying in Boston to fight a losing legal battle. He was at his core an ultimate coward. He knew the federal prosecutors had compiled an airtight, insurmountable case against him. He knew that Chloe, his brilliant intellectual equal, had eagerly signed a proffer agreement and handed the government the direct decryption keys to his private servers. He knew that the digital forensic evidence I had meticulously recovered proved his guilt beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt. Standing trial meant a guaranteed 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The heavy stone walls of justice were rapidly closing in on him, suffocating his fragile ego. So he made the fatal, incredibly desperate decision to run. His official United States passport had been surrendered to the federal court as a strict condition of his bail. But a man who had spent years washing dirty corporate money through complex offshore shell companies still possessed a few dark, untraceable connections. Hiding in a cheap, rundown motel room on the desolate outskirts of the city, Robert tapped into the deep criminal underground. He used a disposable prepaid phone to contact a notoriously shady syndicate he had once utilized to establish his initial dummy corporations in the Caribbean. He desperately needed a completely new identity. He successfully negotiated the purchase of a highly sophisticated forged Canadian passport and a matching provincial driver license. But the dangerous criminals operating in the dark web did not accept credit cards or empty promises. They demanded immediate untraceable payment in full. Robert was completely broke on paper, but his intense lingering paranoia had always driven him to keep one final absolute emergency fund, buried deep beneath thick layers of encrypted code, completely detached from the primary corporate servers that I had permanently locked down. Robert had stashed exactly $200,000 in a highly volatile, obscure cryptocurrency exchange. He had never touched it, leaving the digital currency to sit dormant for years, just in case his glamorous empire ever unexpectedly senile collapsed. Now sitting on the stained, lumpy mattress of his freezing motel room, sweating profusely through his cheap shirt, he pulled out a heavily encrypted backup laptop he had secretly stashed in an anonymous storage locker months ago. His hands shook violently as he carefully entered the complex, multi-tiered sequence of passwords. His escape plan was simple, but incredibly risky. He needed to pull the dormant funds out of the obscure exchange, push them through a digital tumbler to completely scramble the transactional footprint, and drop the clean, untraceable currency directly into a cold, offline crypto wallet. Once the digital coin was safely transferred onto the cold wallet, a small physical hard drive, the exact size of a thumb drive, he could hand it directly to his underground forger, take his brand new passport, and quietly slip across the northern Canadian border under the thick cover of darkness. What Robert completely failed to understand was that he was no longer playing a simple game of hide-and-seek with local law enforcement agencies. He had foolishly declared war on William Harrison. My father did not just rely on the slow, bureaucratic, heavily regulated machinery of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My father personally commanded a private elite financial intelligence network that made the federal government look like complete amateurs, while Robert was sweating in a dingy motel room frantically typing in his passwords. My father was sitting comfortably in his expansive mahogany study, calmly sipping a glass of aged scotch. He had deployed a dedicated team of the most ruthless, brilliant forensic cyber analysts in the entire country. They had spent the last 48 hours doing absolutely nothing but setting invisible, highly sensitive digital tripwires across every single known cryptocurrency exchange and offshore banking node ever associated with Robert's past financial activities. They had built a massive interconnected net of algorithmic surveillance that operated in complete silence. My father knew Robert was a coward. He knew Robert would inevitably try to run, and he knew exactly what obscure digital paths a desperate, terrified man would take to get his hands on untraceable cash. The absolute moment Robert hit the execute button on his laptop, initiating the transfer of his hidden crypto funds, he effectively signed his own permanent death warrant. The transaction did not slip quietly into the dark web as Robert had foolishly hoped. The absolute second the transfer hit the public blockchain ledger, it triggered a massive glaring red alert directly on the secure monitors of my father's cyber intelligence team. My father's lead analyst did not hesitate. They instantly traced the exact geographic location of the digital ping using advanced satellite triangulation. They did not just find the hidden money, they found the precise physical location of the motel room where Robert was hiding. Within seconds, my father picked up his secure telephone and made a direct, highly classified call to the lead federal prosecutor handling the racketeering case. He calmly handed the authorities Robert's exact global positioning coordinates, along with the undeniable digital proof that the disgraced chief executive officer was actively liquidating hidden assets and deliberately attempting to flee federal jurisdiction. Robert had absolutely no idea he was already caught in a massive invisible web. He grabbed a small physical cold wallet, shoved it deep into the pocket of his jacket, and hurriedly left the motel room. He purchased a beaten-up second-hand sedan from a questionable local dealer using the absolute last bit of physical cash he had in his wallet. He merged onto the highway and began the long, agonizing drive straight north toward the Canadian border. He drove for hours in complete heavy silence, his knuckles turning pure white as he gripped the steering wheel with terrifying force. He drove through the dark, winding roads of upstate New York, completely consumed by an overwhelming, suffocating paranoia. Every single set of headlights in his rearview mirror made his heart hammer violently against his ribs. He jumped at every shadow and flinched at every passing truck. But as the miles slowly ticked by and the dense northern forest grew thicker around the highway, a sickening sense of false, arrogant hope began to creep back into his mind. He actually started to believe he had successfully outsmarted everyone. He thought he had outsmarted the federal agents. He thought he had outmaneuvered my father. He could clearly see the large green highway signs, counting down the miles to the international border crossing. 10 miles, 5 miles. He was almost completely free. He vividly imagined himself crossing the border, abandoning the cheap sedan, and starting a brand new wealthy life far away from the total ruin he had left behind in Boston. He was exactly 3 miles away from the border checkpoint when his grand delusion was violently and permanently shattered. The dark, quiet highway suddenly exploded in a terrifying, completely overwhelming display of absolute force. Robert did not even have time to tap his brakes before 3 massive, heavily armored black sport utility vehicles seemingly materialized out of the surrounding forest. They swerved aggressively across the lanes, completely blocking his path and forcing his beat-up sedan to skid wildly onto the rough gravel shoulder. Before Robert could even process the magnitude of what was happening, blinding white spotlights pinned him directly to his driver's seat, illuminating the interior of his car with the intensity of the midday sun. The heavy doors of the armored vehicles flew open, and a massive swarm of federal agents and heavily armed Border Patrol officers poured out into the freezing night air. They surrounded his car instantly with their weapons drawn, their voices barking sharp, deafening commands over the loud, chaotic wail of the police sirens echoing through the trees. Robert sat completely frozen behind the steering wheel, his eyes wide with absolute horror, completely paralyzed by the sheer terrifying magnitude of the ambush. The federal agents did not wait for him to voluntarily surrender. They stepped forward and forcefully shattered the driver's side window with a heavy tactical baton, sending sharp, jagged fragments of safety glass raining down onto his lap. Rough, heavily gloved hands grabbed him violently by the collar of his cheap jacket, dragging him forcefully out of the vehicle and throwing him face first onto the cold, wet asphalt of the highway shoulder. The sharp, unyielding bite of heavy steel handcuffs snapped around his wrist for the second time in less than a week. An agent aggressively searched his pockets, immediately pulling out the forged Canadian passport and the small black crypto wallet he thought would buy his absolute freedom. Robert lay there on the rough gravel, gasping desperately for air, the flashing red and blue emergency lights painting his terrified face in a merciless, rhythmic glow. The untouchable corporate genius was completely gone, reduced to a pathetic, sobbing fugitive, crying endlessly in the dirt. He finally understood the terrifying absolute reach of William Harrison. There was nowhere on earth he could run where my father could not instantly find him. The legal consequences of Robert's failed escape attempt were immediate and absolutely catastrophic. The very next morning, the federal judge presiding over the racketeering case officially and permanently revoked his bail. The judge cited extreme flight risk, ongoing financial fraud, and blatant, unforgivable contempt of the federal court. Robert was transported directly to a maximum security federal detention facility, completely stripped of any possibility of seeing the outside world until his trial began. He was locked in a small windowless concrete box, completely isolated, entirely abandoned, and utterly broken. But the true collateral damage of his cowardice fell directly onto the one person who had blindly and arrogantly tried to save him. The high-risk bail bondsman who had facilitated Robert's temporary release was instantly notified of the official bail revocation. Because Robert had explicitly violated the strict conditions of his release by attempting to flee the country, the entire $5 million bond was immediately forfeit to the state. And because Martha had foolishly pledged the complete equity of her pristine, perfectly manicured suburban estate as collateral, the bail bondsman initiated an immediate, highly aggressive legal foreclosure. I was sitting comfortably in my hospital bed, elevating my healing leg, and reading the morning financial reports on my tablet when my father walked into the room and calmly delivered the news. He told me that Martha had received the official eviction notice just an hour ago. The deeply conservative, affluent woman who had prided herself on her flawless country club reputation, The woman who had barged into my hospital room and demanded that I forgive her abusive son to save her social standing was officially losing her home. She was forced to pack her expensive cashmere sweaters and designer bags into cheap cardboard boxes, while the local county sheriff supervised the immediate seizure of her property. Her wealthy, judgmental neighbors at the country club watched eagerly from their windows as the moving trucks arrived, whispering and gossiping endlessly about the incredible, scandalous downfall of her family. The very community she had worshipped and tried to impress was now watching her spectacular ruin as if it were a television drama. Martha was left with absolutely nothing, entirely destroyed by the very son she had worshipped and protected. As I listened to my father detail the absolute devastating ruin of the people who had tried to break me, I felt a deep, profound sense of ultimate peace. The scales of justice had finally balanced perfectly. The heavy, crushing weight of their betrayal was completely wiped away, and I was finally entirely free. The morning of the final sentencing arrived with a crisp and bitterly cold wind sweeping off the harbor. It was the kind of harsh New York morning that bites sharply at your cheeks and instantly clears the lingering fog from your mind. I stood alone before the full-length mirror in the master bedroom of my new secure apartment. I took my time, meticulously adjusting the sharp lapels of my tailored navy blue suit. It was a suit designed to command absolute respect. It was the armor of a woman who was no longer the quiet and subservient wife hiding deeply in the shadows of a deceitful and ungrateful man. I slowly looked down at my right hand. My fingers rested firmly on the smooth, polished wood of a sleek custom walking cane. My leg was finally healing. The massive, heavy plaster cast that had encased my limb for weeks had recently been replaced by a rigid medical brace, and this wooden cane, but the deep physical scars remained permanently etched into my skin. The heavy titanium screws buried deep inside my bones gave a dull, persistent throb with every step I took. They were my permanent battle wounds. They were the undeniable physical proof of my survival. I grabbed my leather purse and walked confidently out the door. My father, William Harrison, was already waiting for me in the private lobby of the building. He wore his usual immaculate charcoal gray suit. His face was a stoic mask of absolute authority and quiet power. We rode together in the back of his town car in complete, comfortable silence all the way to the federal courthouse. The massive, towering stone pillars of the government building loomed over us, projecting an overwhelming aura of inescapable justice. A large, chaotic swarm of news reporters and flashing camera lights waited anxiously near the bottom of the wide concrete steps. They were eager to catch a quick glimpse of the woman who had single-handedly brought down a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud ring. I did not hide my face from the flashing lights. I held my head incredibly high, leaning gracefully on my wooden cane, letting the entire world see the immense strength I had forged directly from the burning ashes of my broken marriage. My father walked closely beside me, his large, imposing presence serving as a silent, terrifying warning to anyone who even dared to cross our path. We entered through the heavy oak double doors of the courthouse, completely ready to watch the final permanent curtain fall on the monsters who had foolishly tried to destroy me. The federal courtroom was vast, intimidating, and eerily quiet. The polished dark wood paneling and the high vaulted ceilings seemed to absorb every single sound in the room. I slowly made my way down the aisle and took my seat in the very front row of the viewing gallery. I rested my hands perfectly still on the curved handle of my cane, keeping my posture completely straight. My father sat closely to my right, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The large room was absolutely packed with federal prosecutors, busy legal aides, corporate journalists, and curious onlookers. They were all waiting with bated breath for the climax of a financial scandal that had rocked the entire business district to its very core. I stared straight ahead at the empty wooden defense tables. My heart was beating with a steady, rhythmic, and incredible calm. There was absolutely no fear left inside my chest. There was no lingering sadness over the loss of my husband. There was only a cold and absolute readiness for final closure. Suddenly, the heavy side door of the courtroom creaked open loudly. The harsh, rattling sound of heavy metal chains echoed sharply through the silent room. Robert and Chloe were slowly led into the courtroom by 3 armed federal marshals. The immediate sight of them sent a powerful, undeniable wave of pure vindication rushing through my veins. They were completely and utterly unrecognizable. The arrogant, untouchable chief executive officer I had once known was entirely gone. Robert wore a bright, shapeless orange prisoner jumpsuit that completely swallowed his once proud and athletic frame. His expensive custom-tailored suits and his perfect charismatic haircuts were a thing of the distant past. He looked at least 10 years older than his actual age. His face was gaunt, sickly pale, and deeply lined with pure, inescapable exhaustion. Chloe shuffled quietly right behind him, similarly drowning in a hideous and oversized orange uniform. The glamorous, smug legal director, who had cruelly sneered at me, while I bled on the cold office floor, was now nothing but a fragile, trembling, pathetic shell of a human being. Her expensive blonde hair was a dull, tangled mess, and her shoulders were slumped far forward in utter, absolute defeat. The federal marshals directed them to sit down at the defense tables. As Robert slowly sank heavily into his wooden chair, he turned his head slightly. His exhausted, bloodshot eyes locked directly onto mine across the crowded room. I did not break eye contact for a single second. I looked back at him with the chilling and absolute indifference of someone staring at a complete stranger on the street. Robert swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. He quickly looked down at the table, completely unable to bear the heavy, crushing weight of my victorious gaze. The federal judge, a stern, older woman with a legendary reputation for mercilessly punishing white-collar criminals, entered the room from her private chambers and took her seat high up at the wooden bench. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, definitive crack that silenced the entire gallery. The legal proceedings officially began. The judge started the sentencing with Chloe. She looked down at her papers and read aloud the staggering list of severe federal charges: corporate espionage, massive international money laundering, aggravated conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The judge explicitly detailed exactly how Chloe had maliciously weaponized her advanced legal knowledge to establish illegal offshore shell companies. She outlined how Chloe had deliberately masked the continuous flow of stolen employee pension funds across international borders. The judge showed absolutely no mercy as she described Chloe's highly calculated secret plan to abandon her partner in crime and flee to Eastern Europe with a hidden cryptocurrency fortune. Chloe stood up before the judge, shaking so violently that her appointed defense attorney had to hold her arm just to keep her standing upright. She wept loudly and pitifully, offering pathetic, sniveling apologies to the court. She begged relentlessly for mercy, claiming she was just a young and misguided girl who made a simple mistake. The judge stared down at her with absolute unfiltered disgust. The judge stated firmly that Chloe had orchestrated a devastating financial conspiracy that ruined the lives of innocent working families. The sentence was handed down with zero hesitation and zero sympathy. 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Chloe let out a loud, gut-wrenching shriek. Her knees completely buckled beneath her as the federal marshals grabbed her by the arms to drag her away. She sobbed hysterically, her desperate, terrified cries echoing loudly down the long stone corridor until the heavy courtroom doors swung permanently shut. She was finally getting exactly what she deserved for her endless greed. The entire courtroom grew completely dead silent as the judge turned her piercing, unforgiving gaze directly toward Robert. He stood up very slowly. The heavy metal chains wrapped tightly around his ankles clinked softly against the polished floor. He looked incredibly small. He was just a pathetic, broken man facing the ultimate, irreversible consequences of his own boundless arrogance. The judge absolutely did not hold back. She read through his extensive list of severe crimes with a loud voice, dripping in righteous, heavy condemnation. She spoke at length of his massive wire fraud scheme. She detailed his blatant, shameless theft of hard-working employees' retirement funds. She severely criticized his cowardly, desperate attempt to flee the federal jurisdiction under a forged Canadian identity. But then the judge shifted her absolute focus to the most heinous and violent crime of all. She looked directly at me, sitting quietly in the gallery. Then she looked back down at Robert and significantly raised her voice. She aggressively recounted the horrifying events of that freezing Tuesday evening in his office. She detailed exactly how Robert had violently assaulted his own dedicated wife. She stated clearly for the public record how he had intentionally shoved me down a steep flight of glass stairs just to protect his fraudulent hidden empire. She described the severe permanent physical damage to my shattered tibia. She highlighted the absolute sickening lack of human empathy he displayed while I lay bleeding and screaming on his office floor. The judge declared loudly that Robert was a deeply malicious and entirely remorseless predator who viewed human beings as nothing more than disposable stepping stones for his own selfish ambition. She told him that his towering arrogance had finally met its permanent match. The wooden gavel struck the sounding block a second time with a loud booming crack. The judge sentenced Robert Evans to 20 years in a maximum security federal prison for aggravated assault, massive wire fraud, and fleeing federal jurisdiction. 20 long, brutal years locked securely inside a small concrete cage. Robert did not cry. He did not scream or beg. He just stood there, completely hollowed out, staring blankly at the surface of the wooden table. He had lost absolutely everything in the entire world. His stolen wealth, his fake company, his freedom, and his precious pride were entirely gone forever. As the federal marshal stepped forward to firmly lead him away to his new permanent home, he turned his head to look at me one last final time. I sat up tall in my beautiful tailored suit. I rested both of my hands firmly on the top of my wooden cane, and I offered him a very slow, deeply satisfied nod. The final message was perfectly clear. I had completely won the war, and he was absolutely nothing. While Robert and Chloe were being transported away to painfully adjust to their new, miserable lives behind heavy steel bars, the brutal, unforgiving reality of their massive crimes was absolutely decimating the woman who had foolishly tried to protect them. Martha, my intensely hypocritical and incredibly wealthy mother-in-law, had completely lost her incredibly risky financial gamble because Robert had explicitly and brazenly violated his strict bail conditions by attempting to flee across the Canadian border with a fake passport. The local bail bondsman had legally seized the entirety of Martha's pristine country club estate. The affluent, socially obsessed woman who had boldly marched right into my hospital recovery room and demanded that I forgive her abusive son just to protect her precious public reputation was now completely and utterly homeless. The federal government had also successfully seized all of her personal banking accounts because the audit proved Robert had funneled stolen pension money directly into them to continually fund her lavish, extravagant lifestyle. Stripped entirely of her stolen wealth, her expensive designer clothes, and her beautiful, immaculate home, Martha was suddenly forced to face the incredibly harsh reality of the real world. The wealthy, highly judgmental friends from her upscale community church and her exclusive local country club completely and totally shunned her. They immediately stopped returning her frantic, desperate phone calls. They purposely crossed the street and pretended not to see her when they crossed paths in public. She became an absolute permanent social pariah, a highly toxic walking reminder of a massive, shameful financial scandal. With absolutely no money left to her name and no support system to rely on, Martha was ultimately forced to move into a tiny, dirty, rundown studio apartment located on the most undesirable and dangerous outskirts of the city. The incredibly proud woman, who used to endlessly boast to everyone about drinking expensive vintage champagne at elite charity galas, was now relying strictly on government-issued food stamps just to buy her basic weekly groceries. She spent her lonely days sitting entirely by herself in a cramped, dark, drafty room. She was entirely isolated, incredibly bitter, and completely broken in spirit. She had spent her entire life worshipping social status and money far above basic human decency and kindness. Now karma had finally arrived and delivered her exact rightful punishment. She was permanently left to rot in the exact kind of devastating poverty she had always openly mocked and despised. Sitting in that courtroom and watching the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to break me was the most profoundly liberating experience of my entire life. I walked out of the heavy federal building doors and stepped directly into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight. I took a deep breath of the fresh city air, feeling a massive suffocating weight completely lift from my shoulders. I had survived the worst betrayal imaginable, and I had successfully turned my deepest pain into the ultimate weapon of justice. I learned that you should never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who loves deeply, because when that love is violently betrayed, it transforms into an unstoppable force of nature. If you are watching this video and you have ever felt small or powerless in the face of a toxic, manipulative person, remember my story. Never let anyone convince you that you are nothing without them. You hold the pen to your own life story, and you have the power to write your own absolute victory. Thank you so much for listening to my journey today. If you found my story empowering, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of justice. Do not forget to leave a comment down below telling me exactly where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there right now, so I can connect with all of you wonderful people. Stay strong, stay brave, and always fight for the justice you deserve. 1 year later, the bright morning sun filters through the massive glass windows of my new master bedroom. It is a warm golden light that casts a soft, peaceful glow over the rich hardwood floors. I sit on the edge of the large mattress and slowly run my fingers over my lower right leg. There is a long, faint, silvery scar running directly down my shin. It is the permanent physical reminder of the darkest, most terrifying night of my entire life. Exactly 1 year ago, I was lying in a sterile, freezing hospital bed, heavily medicated, staring blankly at a massive white plaster cast, honestly wondering if my life was completely over. The orthopedic surgeon had told my father that the fracture was catastrophic. The long titanium rod and the heavy surgical screws holding my shattered bone together felt like heavy iron weights deliberately designed to drag me down into a deep, inescapable despair. The journey to physical recovery was the most grueling, agonizing experience I have ever endured. I spent countless exhausting hours in physical therapy clinics. I pushed my tired body to the absolute maximum limit. There were terrible days when the white-hot physical pain brought heavy tears to my eyes, days when I wanted to just lie down on the blue exercise mat and completely give up. I remember gripping the metal parallel bars in the clinic, my knuckles turning completely white as I forced myself to take a single agonizing step. My father, William Harrison, was there for every single session. He stood quietly in the corner of the room, his immaculate charcoal suit a stark contrast to the gym equipment, his presence a silent pillar of unwavering strength. Whenever my legs trembled, whenever I felt like collapsing from the sheer exhaustion of it all, I would look over and see his calm, determined eyes. He silently reminded me of exactly who I was. I was a Harrison. We do not break. We do not shatter. We rebuild. And rebuild I did. I traded the heavy plaster cast for a rigid medical brace, and then I slowly traded the brace for a sleek wooden walking cane. I leaned heavily on that cane as I confidently walked into federal courtrooms. I leaned on it as I fearlessly faced the monsters who violently tried to destroy me. But today, that cane sits quietly in the dark back of my closet gathering dust. I no longer need it to support my weight. My leg has fully healed. The bone is fused back together much stronger and thicker than it was before it was broken. The faint silver scar on my shin is no longer a symbol of domestic abuse or tragic victimhood. I wear it proudly, displaying it like a hard-won badge of honor. It is the undeniable physical proof that I walked directly through absolute hell and survived to see the beautiful other side. When the federal government completely dismantled Robert's fraudulent corporate empire, they seized absolutely everything. The massive corporate banking accounts were frozen, the luxury assets were aggressively liquidated, and the corrupt offshore shell companies were permanently dissolved by international authorities. But underneath all the terrible dirt, beneath the massive complicated layers of Robert and Chloe's international money laundering scheme, there was still a legitimate, functioning operational core. There were clean financial assets, viable commercial contracts, and honest, hard-working administrative employees who had been completely blindsided by the devastating federal indictments. Those innocent people had lost their jobs, their financial stability, and their hard-earned retirement pensions because of Robert's insatiable, pathetic greed. They were facing terrible financial ruin through absolutely no fault of their own. I could not simply walk away and let those innocent families suffer for a massive crime they did not commit. My father and I sat down in his large mahogany study and drafted a massive, highly aggressive corporate acquisition plan. We utilized his incredible Wall Street capital and my deep, intimate operational knowledge of the firm. We formally petitioned the federal receivership and successfully bought out all the clean, untainted assets of the old company at a highly competitive, fair market valuation. We completely stripped the toxic corporate entity down to the absolute bare studs and rebuilt it from the ground up under a brand new name on Timbermills. It was a monumental, exhausting undertaking. We spent months conducting rigorous forensic accounting audits, ensuring that every single dollar was completely legitimate and clean. But my primary focus, my absolute non-negotiable demand during the entire restructuring process was the immediate and total restoration of the employee pension funds. I personally directed our elite legal team to take the heavy financial damages we successfully sued Robert and Martha for and pour every single recovered dime directly back into the employees' retirement accounts. I remember the incredible, overwhelming emotional weight of the day we officially called the former staff back into the office. I stood at the head of the main conference room, looking at the tired, anxious faces of the administrative assistants, the project managers, and the janitorial staff. I told them that their stolen money had been fully recovered. I told them that their jobs were completely secure. I watched grown men and women break down in heavy tears of absolute relief. We did not just buy a broken company. We created hundreds of secure, highly paying jobs. We built a brand new corporate culture founded strictly on total transparency, absolute integrity, and mutual respect. I took all the toxic, manipulative, deeply abusive management tactics that Robert had weaponized for years and permanently threw them in the garbage. I implemented open communication channels, fair compensation structures, and rigorous ethical oversight protocols. Working side by side with my father, I learned his legendary ruthless business acumen, but I infused it heavily with my own deep operational empathy. Together, we completely transformed a hollow, corrupt shell into a thriving, highly respected corporate powerhouse. Today, I am no longer the quiet, subservient wife, shrinking herself down to fit into the fragile ego of an arrogant, abusive man. I am the chief executive officer of a highly successful enterprise. I walk into the corporate headquarters this morning with a smooth, confident stride. There is absolutely no limp in my step. The employees greet me with genuine, warm smiles, not the terrified, forced pleasantries they used to offer Robert when he stalked the halls. I take the private executive elevator up to the top floor and step into my magnificent corner office. It is incredibly spacious, flooded with brilliant natural light. The heavy, dark, oppressive furniture that Robert used to hoard has been completely removed. In its place are clean, modern lines, vibrant green plants, and an atmosphere of pure, unfiltered serenity. I walk over to the massive espresso machine resting on a sleek marble counter and pour myself a fresh, steaming cup of dark roast coffee. The rich, bold aroma fills the room, a beautiful, comforting scent that completely overrides the lingering phantom smells of sterile hospital alcohol and harsh chemical bleach that haunted my nightmares for months. I walk over to the expansive floor-to-ceiling glass windows and look out over the magnificent Boston skyline. The morning sky is a brilliant, clear blue, completely devoid of any dark storm clouds. The calm, shimmering waters of the harbor reflect the bright golden sunlight perfectly. I stand there, holding my warm cup of coffee, feeling an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute peace settling deep into my bones. The dark, terrifying chapter of my life is officially closed forever. Robert and Chloe are currently waking up in their respective freezing, windowless, concrete federal prison cells, facing 2 long, miserable decades of total isolation and absolute irrelevance. Martha is waking up in a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment, entirely stripped of her fake social status, and her stolen wealth completely shunned by the affluent community she relentlessly worshipped. They are paying the ultimate, irreversible price for their endless greed and their horrific, unapologetic cruelty. And I'm standing here bathed in the warm morning sunlight, looking down at a beautiful city that I bravely helped conquer. I realized that the heavy, crushing weight of their ultimate betrayal did not completely destroy me. It served as the intense, incredible pressure needed to forge my spirit into unbreakable diamonds. I had survived the worst, most violent physical and emotional trauma imaginable, and I had successfully turned my deepest pain into the ultimate weapon of justice. I learned that you should never, ever underestimate the quiet, patient strength of a fiercely loyal person, because when that profound loyalty is violently betrayed, it transforms into an unstoppable, terrifying force of absolute nature. As I take a slow, comforting sip of my hot coffee, I look at my reflection in the massive glass window. I see a powerful, incredibly resilient woman staring back at me. I see a true survivor. I see a strong leader. I see a dedicated daughter who made her brilliant father incredibly proud. I see a person who completely refused to be a helpless victim in her own life. Looking back on the long, extremely difficult journey that finally brought me to this beautiful, peaceful morning, I have come to a very clear, profound realization about love, trust, and personal boundaries. Sometimes a broken leg is a cheap price to pay to walk out of a toxic marriage and see the demons hiding behind familiar faces. No one has the right to tell you that you are nothing unless you surrender your own worth. If you felt a sense of justice watching me and my father dismantle a traitor's empire, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to support me. Leave a comment below to tell me what state you're watching from and what time it is right now. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.